taking back the power.
As we get closer to the separatists, the military is on alert.
This is the latest murder to have happened here.
Two ABC powerhouses in one night.
All the big issues, no small talk.
To tell the best stories.
Reconnecting you to the rest of the world.
From home and right across the globe.
We've been allowed here to witness an extraordinary awakening.
Foreign Correspondent, followed by Q&A. Thursdays from 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Some shows are informative.
Unprecedented in modern times.
Others are entertaining.
For those who have a go.
But only one show is a bona fide public service.
Story after story.
The team at The Weekly watches all the news so that you don't have to, and puts it all together again so you know everything you need to and nothing you don't. The Weekly. You give us 30 minutes, we'll give you the week. Some assembly required.
The Weekly returns April 27.
The federal election campaign officially underway, with both leaders outlining their pitches to voters.
It's a choice between a strong future and an uncertain one.
We are a great country, but we can be even better.
Plus, the key seats where the election could be won and lost. Evidence that Russian forces used civilians as human shields in Ukraine. And Max Verstappen's Australian Grand Prix comes to an abrupt end, paving the way for Ferrari.
Melbourne, Charles Leclerc wins the Australian Grand Prix for Ferrari.
Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm David Chow. The speculation is over. Australians will head to the polls on Saturday, May the 21st. The Prime Minister announced the election date after visiting the Governor-General in Canberra this morning, meaning we're set for 6 weeks of campaigning. Scott Morrison's pitch is his government is not perfect, but one to stick with in uncertain times. For Anthony Albanese, it's that Australians deserve better, and he's ready to lead. Political editor Andrew Probyn will speak to both of them shortly, and Anthony Green will look at where this election will be won. But first, here's political reporter Jane Norman in Canberra.
For the second time in his prime ministership, the underdog swept through the gates and around the grounds of Government House, seeking vice-regal consent to call an election. He got it, sending 17 million Australians to the polls.
This election is about you, no one else. It's about our country and it's about its future.
With his character under attack and popularity in decline, Scott Morrison's trying not to make this election about him, but rather his government's record.
It's a choice between a strong future and an uncertain one. It's a choice between a government you know and a Labor opposition that you don't.
So you go close up.
A 26-year veteran of federal parliament, the Labor leader's still defining himself to voters.
I am who I am. I'm a working class lad. I'm comfortable in a boardroom and I'm comfortable in a pub.
Anthony Albanese's ditched the big taxing, big spending agenda that Labor took to the last election, adopting a smaller target strategy focused on hot-button issues like childcare and aged care.
I'm ready, we are ready, and Australia is ready for a better future.
But it's personality, not policies, that will likely define this campaign. Scott Morrison handing his opponents more ammunition.
Will Alan Tudge be in your cabinet if your government is returned then?
Alan Tudge is still in my cabinet.
Fact check, he's not. He quit cabinet in March.
It just shows the chaos that's there, even when people step aside.
Scott Morrison's chosen the latest possible date to hold this election, an indication he thinks he can grind his opponent down in coast-to-coast campaigning over 6 weeks. But time and incumbency appear to be more fickle factors now than they were during the pandemic, especially when Labor's out to present this current government as an almost decade-old coalition enterprise, not just the 3.5 years Mr Morrison's presided over.
Our government is not perfect. We've never claimed to be. But we are up front.
Acknowledging the government's flaws, the Prime Minister's appealing to voters to stick with what they know.
There is so much at stake for Australia and our future.
While the Labor leader says there's no time like now to change.
This is our time. Our time to seize the opportunities that are before us.
On May 21.
With the date set, the campaign's officially kicked off.
In the words of the great Ramones, hey ho, let's go.
And judgment from voters awaits.
Thank you very much.
Jane Norman, ABC News, Canberra.
So, what's the state of play and where will the election be won? Here's Chief Election Analyst Anthony Green.
Scott Morrison called his 2019 win a miracle.
And tonight we've been delivered another one.
But it was a narrow win that leaves little room to move in 2022. After boundary changes, the starting point is the coalition has just 76 seats, the minimum needed for majority government. A uniform swing of 2.6% should deliver Labor more seats in the government, and 3.2% a majority Labor government. Current polls show Labor easily achieving that swing, but any narrowing of its lead puts the election in doubt and potentially brings a larger crossbench into play, with the coalition under threat from independents in a string of traditionally safe seats. And last time the swing wasn't uniform. Labor went into the 2019 election with high hopes in Queensland. But the swing was strongly to the coalition. It holds just 6 of the 30 seats north of the Tweed and wants to improve that in regional seats like Flynn and Leichhardt and Brisbane seats like Longman and Dixon, held by Defence Minister Peter Dutton. Labor also has high hopes in Western Australia after last year's crushing state election victory. It's eyeing 3 seats in Perth. The coalition would need to offset losses in the resources states in New South Wales. It had high hopes, but they've dimmed since the departure of Gladys Berejiklian and the consecutive COVID waves. Both parties have marginal seats to defend there. Overall, the election will be decided in those 3 states. But if it's close, the leaders could be sweating on a handful of seats in other states to decide the winner. The government's path to re-election is narrow, while there are many more options for Labor to win. But then, that's what we all said in 2019.
At the outset, the 2 leaders have defined the choice for voters, but they've also ignored some key questions that may weigh on the minds of the 17 million Australians who will cast their ballots. Political editor Andrew Probyn fills out some of those blanks.
The political equation's pretty simple. If this election becomes a referendum on Scott Morrison, then Anthony Albanese will become Australia's 31st Prime Minister. Assessments of the PM as untrustworthy and a bully handicap Morrison in a race where he's already behind. But he will seek to hobble his opponent by stoking doubts about the Labor leader's capacity and experience. He senses Albanese hasn't done enough to define himself, so will seek to do it for him in a bid to frighten voters into sticking with the incumbent. So prepare for a vicious and personal tale of 2 leaders, each telling a story about the other. And when they do make their own case, Morrison will argue he's saved lives during the pandemic, stood up to Beijing's coercion and strengthened alliances through AUKUS. Albanese will reassure voters he's someone who can bridge the gap between the boardroom and shop floor and has a vision for the future. Election campaigns have their own dynamic. Scrutiny is intense. Morrison is a proven campaigner. Albanese faces his first as leader. Now they both need a weary nation to listen. Scott Morrison joins me now. Prime Minister, you said today that Australians were tired of politics. Could the truth be that they're actually tired of you?
Well, it's been a tough few years. People have been getting through the pandemic, and Australia is now coming out of that pandemic with one of the strongest jobs records and strongest economic growth records amongst the advanced world. And so we now need to make a big decision, and that decision is to keep a strong economy, which means a stronger future, guaranteeing the essential services Australians rely on, or risking it all by going in a different path with a Labor opposition whose economic record just doesn't measure up.
But do you worry that judgments about you have hardened and they're not flattering?
This election is about the people watching right now. It's not about any individual, it's not about me or anyone else. It's about you who are watching and your priorities and ensuring that your job, your future, training for young people right across the country, the investment in the infrastructure that we're delivering, a stronger economy, delivering that stronger future. Labor's alternative, their financial management, their economic management, their record is well known, and it doesn't measure up to deliver that strong economy that we need for the future.
Well, as you say, this first term has been dominated by a pandemic. If you do win a second term, can we expect to see a reform agenda from you?
Well, our economic plan is to keep taxes low and cut red tape. It's to ensure we're investing in the skills and infrastructure Australia needs, and we are investing in those skills and infrastructure. It is ensuring reliable and affordable energy to drive our economy into the future. We're embracing the data and digital economy to lead the world in this area in the top 10 by 2030, and we're making things here in Australia, particularly for our defence industries and giving our sovereign manufacturing capability. In the last 12 months, we've turned around the budget by over $100 billion. That is the strongest recovery we've seen in 70 years. But to keep that going, we need to keep going forward with that plan that is delivering one of the strongest economies in the world today coming out of this pandemic.
PM, thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot.
And now we go to Launceston for the Labor leader. Mr Albanese, you're the politician who's long said he likes to fight Tories. You now claim to be the consensus leader. Which is the real Anthony Albanese?
Well, I said that once, and I said that in the context in 2012 when the Labor Party was tearing itself apart. Disunity is a real problem, and what we're seeing at the moment is disunity on the other side of politics, and that is one of the things that's leading to chaos on the other side and a failure to govern. I've been consistent, if you look at my record, in creating Infrastructure Australia, creating regional development Australia, looking at bodies that bring business and unions together, bring people together in the common interests.
Your pitch is one of safe change, but how would Australia change if you become Prime Minister?
We take climate change seriously and see it as an opportunity, not just a challenge. You'd have 82% renewables by 2030. You'd create 604,000 new jobs and you'd reduce energy prices. We'd use that to create new industry, to create jobs in manufacturing in particular. And we'd do that by having more secure work, but we'd also have a strengthening of Medicare and a support for not just childcare as an economic reform, but also support for dealing with the crisis in aged care.
So by year's end, what will you have achieved if you do win on May 21st?
We will have established a National Reconstruction Fund. We will be starting to transform the energy grid for the 21st century. We'll be fixing the NBN. We'll be making progress in fixing aged care by dealing with simple challenges that are there, even things like nutrition, where we've got Maggie Beer on board to assist with that process. We will be a more outward-looking, more forward-looking country under my leadership and under a government I hope to lead. At the moment, you have a government that just looks backwards, that isn't planning for the future. You can't change a country overnight, but what you can do is work with the country going forward. And one of the first things I'll do is to convene a full employment summit, which will get business and unions around the table trying to work out how we boost productivity in a way that leads to higher profits and higher wages.
Mr Albanese, we're out of time. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew.
New South Wales will be crucial to forming the next government. It has the most number of seats in the country, and analysts will be closely watching which way the political wind is blowing. State political reporter Ashley Raper takes a look at the key electorates.
New South Wales has a large portion of vulnerable seats, and there's a concentration of them in Western Sydney. The government currently holds Lindsay, Banks and Reid, which is considered somewhat of a bellwether seat. Labor's marginal seats in the western suburbs are Macquarie, Parramatta and Greenway. On the Central Coast, there are 2 seats, and Labor and the Liberals have 1 apiece, but they do regularly change hands. Then there are the Sydney seats of Wentworth and North Sydney, where independents are attempting to do what Zali Steggall did last election. 3 years later, Warringah is likely to stay independent. In southern Sydney, the Liberals are up against party defected Craig Kelly in Hughes, in what is traditionally a safe seat for the party. On the south coast, the Liberals too are desperately trying to win back Gilmore, which Labor picked up in 2019, while Labor's margin in Eden Monaro is slim. There are also some key electorates to watch in the Hunter area that are held by Labor. Further north, in flood-devastated areas, Labor is likely to retain the marginal seat of Richmond, while Page is a safe national seat. It covers Lismore, and there's been a lot of anger locally at the government's response to the disaster.
2 years of COVID pain in Victoria, and the impact it's had on people's lives is yet to be tested at the ballot box. And that may throw up challenges across the political spectrum. All parties will be keeping a close eye on Victorian marginal seats like Chisholm in Melbourne's east and Corangamite in the Geelong region. Here's state political reporter Richard Willingham.
From bustling Box Hill in the north to Monash University in the south, the electorate of Chisholm is at the heart of Melbourne's middle-rung suburbs. It's also the 3rd most marginal seat in the country, held by the Liberals by just 0.5%. This patch of Glen Waverley was the closest between the two parties at the last election. If Labor is to win office, it must pick up Chisholm.
I'd like to see some policies on the future of housing and housing affordability in Australia.
I'd actually like to see some proper, serious investment in higher education and quality education.
The election is unlikely to be decided in Victoria.
It's great to be here.
Even when the coalition has won in recent elections, it has not won a majority in the state.
It's a nice area.
And that trend is set to continue, but there are some significant seats at play. Chisholm is one of 39 Victorian seats. Labor holds 21, the Coalition has 15, the Greens have Melbourne, and independent Helen Haynes holds Indi. There's also a new seat of Hawke on Melbourne's outer northeast boundary. On paper, it looks safe for the ALP, but it's vulnerable to swings. Across Melbourne's outer suburbs, COVID hit hard. Party strategists and insiders have noticed a change in voter sentiment, with lingering frustration about the pandemic. Voters feel neglected by the major parties, and it's fertile ground for emerging blocs, including Clive Palmer or strong local independents. The Liberals are also on the defensive in blue ribbon seats like here in Kooyong, as well as Goldstein, where well-backed independents are a chance of upsetting the status quo, which would make Scott Morrison's second miracle mission even more difficult. In Victoria's north, Shepherd and independent Rob Priestley is right in the mix. Nichols is a 3-cornered contest after Nationals Damien Drum decided to hang up the boots. Only Dunkley and Corangamite changed hands in 2019 on the back of helpful redistributions for the ALP. If Labor can't hold these seats, the path to the lodge gets rocky for Anthony Albanese.
Well, I think for me, and I think for most of the community here, it's climate change.
Helping kids that are having mental health issues as a result of COVID and everything that's gone through that.
It's really hard for a lot of young people to buy in the area, to rent, so it'd be really great if we can find some way to support younger Australians in their search for housing.
Victoria's marathon COVID experience is untested at the ballot box. An anti-government sentiment does exist in the community. Liberals concede that Victoria is difficult, with published polling showing Labor well ahead. But be prepared for some inconsistent and unusual results in different pockets of this city and state. Richard Willingham, ABC News, Melbourne.
And a reminder, the ABC's voter engagement tool, Vote Compass, is available again for this election campaign. It takes about 10 minutes to complete and will let you know where you stand in the political landscape. Go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes and click on the Vote Compass icon. Evidence of widespread atrocities continue to emerge in the wake of the withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine's north. Accounts of torture and kidnappings of civilians are mounting in regions that were occupied by the Russians since they first invaded from just across the border in Belarus. The ABC's Sean Rubenstein-Dunlop reports from the village of Yahudne, where civilians say they were held captive and used as human shields. And a warning, this report contains distressing details.
A community in ruins, now held captive by shock and trauma. This farming village near the Belarusian border was occupied by Russian soldiers storming Ukraine's north.
When we arrived, we saw many bodies lying around. People were terrified.
Mykola Klimchuk, a local supermarket worker, was taken at gunpoint to this school.
So this man's counting the steps as we go down here into this school basement where he was held captive by Russian forces for weeks. He's going to show us what it was like.
He was forced to live here for nearly a month with more than 300 others. Families crammed in with the elderly, with buckets for toilets and little fresh air. The oldest was 91, the youngest just 2 months old.
So why did the Russians make you stay here?
We were taken hostage and used as human shields. They were taking some of us up to the schoolyard where military vehicles were kept. The Ukrainian drone could see that there were civilians here and couldn't drop bombs.
Mykola shows how he slept upright for 25 nights.
You tied yourself with your scarf.
A calendar marked each day, alongside drawings from children who depicted their brutal reality. 12 elderly people died in here. This was where their bodies rested, before they piled up in a boiler room upstairs.
They were lying here for 3 to 7 days. When we were burying the first 5 people, the Russians started shelling the cemetery and injured 2 of our people who were digging the graves.
Another captive, Svitlana Brihinets, a teacher at the school, lost her home and family.
2 of my brothers died. We found one of them buried in the backyard. He was shot in the head, and my other brother. People saw the Russians blindfolding and torturing him, but we can't find his body.
Ukrainian liberators couldn't come soon enough to the communities here who have evidence of potential war crimes and what they say will be scars for life. Sean Rubenstein-Dunlop, ABC News, Yahidne.
Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has been ousted from office after losing a vote of no confidence in Parliament. Opposition supporters danced in celebration on the streets of Islamabad after the late-night vote. The former cricket great has been accused of poor economic management and for clamping down on dissent during his term as leader. Imran Khan was elected Prime Minister in 2018, promising to fight corruption and improve the economy. The 69-year-old has claimed there's a US-led conspiracy against him, and his supporters say they'll fight to have him reinstated. An interim Prime Minister will be appointed to serve until the elections are held late next year. And there's little sign of China changing its strict zero-tolerance approach to COVID-19, ordering all 19 million people in the southern city of Guangzhou into mandatory testing, following just 2 cases. Further north in Shanghai, videos showing civilians fed up with the strict pandemic measures are circulating on Chinese social media. Another shows a drone urging residents to comply with COVID restrictions and to control their soul's desire for freedom. Shanghai's 25 million residents remain under a strict citywide lockdown that began last week. There are widespread reports of limited access to food and medicine. Harsh restrictions have failed to contain the outbreak, with the city reporting more than 23,000 new infections in the latest round of testing. The Sydney Roosters have won their first NRLW premiership, defeating the Dragons 16-4.
An all New South Wales decider hosted in Queensland. Still, 7,855 fans were eager to witness the first NRLW grand final to be played in the Sunshine State. And the crowd didn't have to wait long for the first try of the afternoon.
And the Dragons, inside 90 seconds, open the scoring on grand final day.
Shortly after, the Dragons would lose playmaker Talia Fuimeono to the bin after a high shot on Bridie Parker, who suffered a serious knee injury. The Roosters tried time after time to score, but couldn't break the Dragons' defence.
Again, they come up with amazing defence.
But the points would finally come in the second half.
The Roosters tied up in the grand final.
The Roosters would add another 10 minutes later.
Look out, here goes Isabel Kelly!
But it was the match winner with just minutes to go, which was clouded by controversy.
Player down, and they must stop play. Oh no, Higgins! But this doesn't look right. That is a Roosters trainer saying, let's stop play. Next minute, the Roosters score a try.
And the last try, I'm not really sure, if that's an obstruction or not, but at the end of the day, the Roosters were a better team.
The girls were just outstanding, so proud of them.
Jessica Stewart, ABC News, Redcliffe.
Ferrari's Charles Leclerc has won this year's Australian Formula One Grand Prix in emphatic fashion in the race's return to Melbourne. It was a tough day for reigning world champion Max Verstappen, who was forced to retire mid-race.
After the longest wait, Ferrari is once again back on top in Australia.
This one means a lot, clearly.
There was a sense of anticipation as Formula One returned to Melbourne, waiting for a race 3 years in the making.
Melbourne, we welcome the world back to Australia. The Australian Grand Prix is go. We're racing in Melbourne.
It didn't take long for the revised track to claim its first victim as Carlos Sainz's horror weekend continued. A strong start from Lewis Hamilton pushed him up the order as the 7-time world champion battled with Red Bull's Sergio Perez.
What a move!
A back and forth that was cut short due to a safety car after 2-time winner in Australia Sebastian Vettel crashed out.
So Aston Martin just to complete their shocking weekend.
Ferrari's newfound pace this season continued to pay dividends as Charles Leclerc held off a challenge from the world champion Max Verstappen.
Leclerc still has it, just
before his Red Bull machinery fouled him.
That's some weird fluid. Yeah. Everything is itself.
Mercedes pair of Hamilton and George Russell started to find their form in a battle with Red Bull's Sergio Perez, but there was no stopping Leclerc, the 24-year-old claiming his first win in Australia and the second for the season.
The man from Monaco, magic in Melbourne, Charles Leclerc wins the Australian Grand Prix for Ferrari.
McLaren teammates Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris largely battled it out with each other, Norris finishing 5th and the Australian cheered home in 6th. After a 2-year absence, fans certainly have turned out in force. A record number of F1 fans have made their way to Albert Park, with more than 400,000 making their way through the gates over the 4 days. And with a crowd of 128,000 today, the Grand Prix is back on the podium of major events. Fraser Fife, ABC News, Melbourne.
Let's take a look at the satellite. A cold front is extending west of Kangaroo Island in South Australia to west of Tasmania and further south into the Southern Ocean. On the synoptic, a trough is causing showers and storms across New South Wales and Western Australia's southeast, while drawing warm winds from the interior to South Australia, Victoria and Tasmania. Looking around the states for tomorrow, for Queensland, there will be a slight to medium chance of showers along the east coast, increasing to a high to very high chance about the Whitsundays and the coast north of Ingham. For New South Wales and the ACT, a few showers about the southeast later as a southerly change moves through. In Victoria, it will be cloudy with scattered showers on and south of the ranges, contracting to the east during the evening. Tasmania will have showers about the northeast, west, south and central areas, easing during the evening. In South Australia, there will be a slight to medium chance of showers about the southern and central coastal districts. To WA, there will be showers and thunderstorms over the southwest land division, southern goldfields, Eucla and far southern south interior. To the NT, a medium to high chance of showers and thunderstorms across the northeast Arnhem district, with a slight chance of showers over Bathurst Island and in the far eastern Carpentaria district. Looking ahead to Tuesday's forecast for the capital cities, Brisbane mostly sunny, Sydney will have showers, Canberra a shower or two, And that's the latest from ABC News. Remember, you can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm David Chow. Stay with us. Close of Business is next.
A young couple on a mission.
It's a really daunting and high-stakes project. They're in the middle of nowhere out here.
Braving extreme weather and isolation.
And there have been moments where I've told Reese that I'm not sure if we can keep going.
To help turn around our extinction crisis.
It was a moment for a high five because we'd finally hit that goal.
We need these animals back in this desert. Big projects like this show we can do it.
Australian Story. Tomorrow on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Are you ready for the Gardening Australia Easter special?
Maggie Beer is cooking up a new project.
It's about no longer allowing institutionalised food. And there's so much we have to do because there's so many people without support.
Enter a breathtaking world of colour.
I just think that looks magnificent.
And why not try edible flowers with your eggs this Easter?
These little beauties also have a little sweet treat hiding for you.
Gardening Australia, Friday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
We can't undo the lies we had to tell, girls.
I'm Finn, Dennis's son.
You have no idea what he's capable of.
How do we know that you are what you say you are?
I knew my dad, he wasn't a murderer. I knew he did it.
Family is the only thing that matters in the end.
Smother, Friday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Building a home causes a range of emotions.
What? Mad? Wow.
Some visions are meticulously planned.
Every inch. So well crafted.
This is exactly what I hoped it would be.
That is magic. I mean, proper magic.
Others just go with the flow.
Drunken eBay purchase. It's going to be really urban meets rural.
How are you going to do it?
Not sure yet.
All new grand designs. Next Sunday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Hello, I'm Alicia Barry. Welcome to Close of Business. Coming up on the program, the new normal, meet the employees permanently working from home and why bosses are happy about it.
We work on the basis that people here are adults, they can make adult decisions, and that means they'll probably make right decisions.
And red flags over finfluencers, how handing out financial advice could land the new cool wealth advisors in jail.
If you're a finfluencer, and if you don't have a licence, then you need to be careful not to provide financial advice.
Also on the program, tackling multinational tax dodgers. Both major parties commit to a clampdown, but can they make them pay? Just over 2 years on from the first stay-at-home orders, a revolution in how we work is reshaping Australian lives. The impacts are being felt from the CBDs to the suburbs as the former office workers continue to stay home with the blessing of their bosses. Daniel Ziffer has more.
Jenny and Wally are at work.
Work-life balance immediately became so much more positive for me.
Like millions, Jenny isn't going back to the office full-time. She'll continue working from home even as COVID restrictions ease.
It's not the same life at all. It's for me, it's a much better balance. I'm a lot more relaxed. I'm a lot more relaxed in what I need to do during the day. I feel less pressure. There's a lot less distractions.
Having stopped a daily 2.5-hour commute through Melbourne's suburbs, she's only expecting to visit the office once a year. And her boss is delighted.
If a boss is saying you've got to come back to work, I think the reasonable question is why? Why do I have to do that? How does the business benefit? How does the individual benefit?
Almost none of Mark Fletcher's 75 employees are coming into the office.
We work on the basis that people here are adults, they can make adult decisions, and that means they'll probably make right decisions. They'll make mistakes from time to time, but overall they'll make right decisions.
Tonight, empty streets as Victorians stay in.
It's eerie in the city.
I've never seen it so quiet.
The pandemic has changed lives because over 1/3 of workers can do at least part of their job at home.
We've fundamentally challenged the traditional way of working on where, how and when work is done, and it has worked. There have been really positive outcomes for organisations and for people.
Compared to 2019, office occupancy in the Melbourne CBD is at 15%, and it's similar in Sydney at 18%. Even cities barely touched by restrictions are seeing far more empty desks now than before the pandemic. The combination of long commutes, cheap technology and newfound freedoms means 2 years into an experiment that was forced upon us, there's a new normal.
I'm not going to tell my people what day they need to be back in the office or how many days they need to be back in the office. I think, we're really going to embrace this new way.
Major employers are weighing up how much real estate they need, now that office workers might only come in 2 or 3 days a week.
Gone are the days where you see the old brown carpet and brown walls and just a very stale type of office environment. That's not going to attract workers back to the office.
Software company boss Luke Anea is inside his company's new building that embraces a hybrid model of work.
Some prefer to work at home for periods and others love to be in the office. So we need to make sure that we're building workplaces that provide teams that flexibility so that they can do their best work each day.
So the balance of power has really shifted from employers to employees, and employees want flexibility.
Before the pandemic, only 2 of Mark Fletcher's 75 employees worked from home. Now he's got employees in New Zealand and interstate. Staff are more productive and happier.
Awful as COVID has been, I think it gives us an opportunity for a reset and a refresh towards this brighter future of a different working situation.
The tools that office workers use, like email, video conferencing and shared documents, have been around for decades. Many of them are free. What the pandemic changed 2 years ago is it forced bosses to trust their staff to work even when they couldn't see them.
I think giving the flexibility to your employees to work at home allows you to work the best way that suits you.
More productive workers and happier puppies.
The price pain at the supermarket register is real and set to get worse. With the unofficial cost of living election campaign in full swing, a top investment outfit has confirmed what every shopper knows. Morningstar says food prices were up 4% in the first quarter of this year and will rise by a mid-single-digit percentage in the second half. It expects abnormally high price increases to boost supermarket earnings in the near term by offsetting the rising cost of goods and higher energy prices. The rise in food prices is a global phenomenon as the war in Ukraine hits every aspect of production. Surging costs for fuel and fertiliser are pushing up the price of staple cereal crops, creating new winners and losers. I spoke with Citi's chief Asia economist Joanne Chua. Joanna Chua, here in Australia, the federal election campaign is essentially looking like it will be fought on cost of living pressures, but it does look like a lot of that is out of government control.
You're absolutely right to the extent that what's driving cost of living is these large exogenous supply side shocks driven especially by the Russia-Ukraine geopolitical tensions. In a sense, a lot of the policy support that governments can do, especially on monetary policy, is really more to influence the demand side of the inflation equation. Now, of course, what we're seeing in a lot of poorer economies, you can use intervention via fiscal policy, but Australia doesn't have that history of using fiscal intervention, especially when it comes to food prices.
And that has a lot to do, I believe, with our per capita income.
I think it's just, it's a function partly of, the history and how people respond to policy. So usually in cases like richer economies like Australia, food is not a very large component of the CPI basket. In fact, among advanced economies, Australia is quite low. It's really the more poorer economies and households that spend a lot more on their budgets on food, and especially food prepared at home rather than food away from home. So these are the type of commodities that are very vulnerable to shocks. And so to the extent that household incomes are very low and they spend a lot on the budget and they have very little social safety net, they're really a lot more vulnerable. So that's why, in this environment, we're seeing, for example, in a number of places, government can become more proactive in intervening, providing subsidies for fertilizer, for farmers, or cooking oil. You see that more on the poor economies. So that's where we are at this juncture. I think Australia comes out much less vulnerable at this point.
Russia and Ukraine are, of course, very large grain producers and have been known as the breadbasket of Europe. How has the war in Ukraine affected that?
No, so absolutely. I think it's creating a lot of concerns about supply and delivery of supply, especially, in Ukraine, for example. So we've already seen global grain prices go up. We've seen big adjustments in wheat prices. We've seen it in corn, in barley, to a lesser extent in soy. So that obviously has cascading impacts also in Asia, to the extent that they form at least either directly or indirectly via animal feed, some component of our CPI basket. Now, it does vary quite a bit in the region because you hear a lot, for example, North Africa being quite exposed because of large trade linkages, but it also depends on the diets and what really comprises the CPI baskets. So, for example, in Asia Pacific, you have, for example, places like, Australia, New Zealand, very large, but Australia, who itself is also a large wheat exporter, have a lot more bread and wheat in their basket. You also see it in parts of South Asia, where wheat is larger. But then once you kind of go a little bit on East Asia, especially Southeast Asia, Philippines, Thailand, rice is much more significant. And I think there's a little bit more, there's a bit of desynchronization of cycles. So I think rice prices, because a lot of it is really produced in the region, they have kind of more local factors driving the prices. So there's a bit of discrepancy, which is part of the reason why we don't see as kind of broad-based pressures on inflation. But I think the question is whether we're going to eventually see a correlation of global grain prices that can spill over to rice, especially because fertilizer prices have also gone up on the back of what's happened on the Russia-Ukraine geopolitical front.
You mentioned Australia there. Have there been any winners from the fact that Ukraine and Russia are constrained in their production?
Of course, I don't want to talk about winners, given that obviously it's a very unfortunate event, but we can talk more, not so much about absolute winners, but sort of relative, because this shock, obviously, it's not good for global growth. It's not good for inflation. And some regions, some places are much more vulnerable. We all worry a little bit, for example, about Europe and the exposure there with the gas prices, et cetera. But I think on a relative basis, I think where Australia comes out relatively better is because you don't have a lot of trade linkages directly in that troubled region. And Australia is also a net exporter of major commodities that are impacted by the geopolitical shock, whether you're talking about energy, whether you're talking about wheat, or whether you're talking even about metals, for example. So you can make an argument from a terms of trade shock. For most of East Asia, it's kind of negative, with the exception of a few. And kind of Australia kind of comes out on a relative basis where it's a positive terms of trade shock. But you have to balance that positive terms of trade shock on the winners from the windfall of higher prices. And if the winners of the higher prices, are they going to actually spend the windfall through capex, through spending? And you have to balance that with the losers. And even, for example, within Australia, of course, households will face higher inflation. So that's also going to have a hit on discretionary income at the margin. But relative to everyone else, I think Australia does fairly better.
I was going to pick you up on that inflation consumption story, because how is the double spectre of rising interest rates and rising food prices going to play out in economies like Australia?
Yeah, so look, I think usually, obviously, inflation is picking up, but I wouldn't say it's all just driven by supply side. Of course, the supply side factors are compounding the impact, but we had very accommodative monetary policy since the pandemic. And obviously, as you kind of normalize and start living with the COVID, then demand's going to pick out. And so obviously, as a response to that, a lot of central banks are going to have to normalize monetary policy. So part of the design of monetary policy is to calibrate demand relative to supply so you can manage inflation relative to target. But again, the question is the tightening going to be very abrupt to the point that it will significantly hurt demand? Based on our assumption, for example, if we compare Australia to some of the economies, like, for example, the US, we're not expecting as aggressive of a policy rate adjustment, right? So I think in the case of the US, where I think a lot of people would argue that maybe the Fed was a little bit more back-footed because of demand, then they have to adjust more. Of course, the risk here is if inflation surprises significantly, and central banks end up being behind the curve, that they have to adjust even more aggressively to dampen demand. That's when we worry about a harder landing.
Joanna Chua, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
The war in Ukraine has also pushed up energy and mineral prices, boosting Australia's bottom line. The Department of Industry expects export earnings to climb 33% this financial year to $425 billion. Coal will become the second Australian commodity after iron ore to break through the $100 billion mark. And as nations rush to buy materials for batteries, earnings for lithium, nickel and copper are forecast to rise nearly 40% to more than $23 billion. Australians will go to the polls next month, and multinational tax avoidance is shaping up to be an election issue for many businesses. Both major parties say they're committed to ensuring companies pay their fair share of tax by implementing global rules, which include a 15% minimum rate. But it's unclear how soon the plan will be implemented and how much revenue is up for grabs, as Nassim Kadem reports.
Having sufficient cash flow to pay taxes is one of the hardest parts of running a hairdressing salon. Owner Joey Scandizo says it's unfair small businesses have to fork out their fair share while multinationals can exploit loopholes in the law.
It is difficult to hear that they are getting away with it. Like, we work so hard to keep our business afloat.
In this year's budget, the government promised the Australian Taxation Office an extra $653 million for it to clamp down on multinationals. Since being set up in 2016, the ATO's Tax Avoidance Task Force has issued $26 billion in tax bills and collected $15 billion in cash. Both major parties have also committed to the OECD G20 Global Tax Plan that would force companies to pay a minimum rate of 15% instead of little or no tax at all now.
We've actually been front and centre to these efforts.
But it's unclear how soon the plan can be introduced and how much money the government will bank.
Some of the details are still being worked out, so it's not clear what actually would be the revenue implications for Australia.
Labor says it will speed up implementation of the OECD plan.
Right now, 2/5 of multinational profits are channelled through tax havens. The world is moving on this, but Australia is being left behind.
The OECD G20 tax plan has been years in the making. Governments around the world are struggling to pay for public services and want a bigger share of the revenue pie. But tax experts say Australia may only be a small winner.
The idea is to say some of this extra profit that you're making really should go to the place where the consumers are.
Former ATO Second Commissioner Andrew Mills says Australia's done well to tax multinationals, but because we have a relatively small population, it's estimated the global plan will bring in about $1 billion.
We're 25 million people out of 7 billion, so we're not a big market in the scheme of things, so it's not surprising that we're not expecting billions and billions of dollars.
Tax analysts say that's why the global minimum tax rate should be more than 15% and legal loopholes must be closed.
Right now, it's incredibly easy for companies to shift the revenue to places where it's taxed the least or, in many cases, not taxed at all.
Joey says policies to fight tax avoidance will play a part in helping him decide who he votes for at the upcoming election.
It will come into account once I'm making my judgment, but it would be one part that I'd love to see fixed and adjusted.
The issue could help sway the votes of many other Australians.
The unemployment rate is nearing its lowest in half a century. Despite that, nearly 1.5 million Australians are out of work or can't get the hours they want. And there's been a significant increase in the number of people relying on welfare payments to survive, as Gareth Hutchins reports.
When Ashley Stevenson lost her job 8 years ago, she never imagined it would be her last. Since then, she's applied for hundreds of roles and is still without work.
You have to make choices between medicine and food, rent and food, choices that in Australia you shouldn't have to make.
She's been on the waiting list for public housing for 7 years and spent the last 2 without a permanent place to sleep.
When I was renting, I couldn't afford haircuts. I had to go without 7 meals in order to afford a haircut so I could go to an interview.
She's one of nearly 1.5 million people who can't find a job or work the hours they want.
In a period where we've had COVID, there's been a huge amount of extra unpaid care work that predominantly women have had to take up. But then also we've seen a changing nature in the kind of work that's available and the increase in casualisation.
Although the official jobless rate is nearing its lowest level in half a century, there are now more people relying on unemployment payments to survive than there were before the pandemic, even if some of them also work part-time. And public policy lecturer Elise Klein says more Australians than ever are holding down 2 jobs.
It's a problem people working 2 jobs because it signals that the quality of the jobs out there are not in track with what people need to keep up with the cost of living.
When people lose a job and are lucky enough to find another one, like Jerry Andrews, their new positions won't necessarily pay the same wages and conditions.
It has been an incredible struggle. My pay has significantly seen a reduction in terms of my annual income, up to even 40%. So that has had a major impact on my lifestyle choices and how I survive financially.
The single dad of 3 says the rising cost of living has made his situation much harder.
It's not easy, and I guess you just have to make ends meet. And so, often I have done odd jobs apart from my full-time job and tried to do a side hustle.
The pre-election budget was supposed to be about bringing the cost of living down, but for Australians trapped in precarious work or locked out of the labour market, it's done little to help them.
The budget was a joke for people in poverty. The $250 payment was a joke. People can't use that to pay their rent. They can't use that to pay their food bills.
Anti-Poverty Centre spokesman Jay Coonan says raising welfare payments to more than $600 a week would help more people get back into work.
Right now, people are punished for being unemployed. People are punished for every step that they take to try and improve their lives.
At the end of this year, Ashley Stevenson turns 67 and is able to claim the aged pension. She hopes it will give her more financial security.
As long as they don't put all pensioners, all welfare recipients on the in-due card.
A birthday present worth an extra $150 a week.
It's what investors were expecting. Now the US Federal Reserve has put a dollar amount on it. America's central bank says it's preparing to slash the size of its swollen balance sheet by $95 billion a month. The minutes from the March meeting also show officials are open to more aggressive rate rises to battle inflation running at a 40-year high. A move of 50 basis points could come as soon as next month. To the share market, which finished the week basically where it began. The ASX 200 and the All Ords were down just slightly by the end of the week. Jean-Bei Liu from Tribeca Investment Partners says it was a bumpy ride for investors, but the market managed to bounce back by the week's end.
This has been a volatile week where investors become quite worried about the high inflation and increased expectations of lots of interest rate increases in the US. And here in Australia, even RBA has talked to sooner interest rate and more interest rate increases by the end of this year. So quite a lot of worry for the investors. We're seeing a lot of rotation within the market and simply by selling the businesses that's been trading on very expensive multiple like the tech and moving into inflation hedges such as some of the commodity and energy space. And today is well needed support as investors sort of piling back, buying on the dip really.
And it really was those mining and energy sectors that led the charge. How did the market play out?
Look, absolutely. Look, mining and energy stock incredibly outperformed the rest of the market. And so far this year, most of them has done more than 30-40% relative to the rest of the sector, such as the growth sector, the technology firms, which share price has declined, some by more than 40% so far this calendar year. So quite a lot of rotation, and we're just seeing a lot more of it this week as well, as the investors become more concerned about the inflation and interest rates.
And one standout on the market was the uranium producer Paladin, up around 11%.
Look, absolutely. This is a very good news for investors that participated in the equity raising. Share has come through and done incredibly well, and there's also quite a lot of demand for alternative energy such as uranium. So, and this is just an example that return is continuing very positively for investors.
And we've been talking about inflation and food price inflation, and GrainCorp has increased its profit outlook.
Look, absolutely. The weather has been fantastic for GrainCorp, and it's been fantastic for quite some time. This accounts for more than 5 upgrades in the last 12 months. It's just been incredible. And at the same time, food costs, as you mentioned before, food costs has gone up significantly. The prices for grain, because of disruptions and the conflict that's taking place in Ukraine, just means that profit is going higher for this company.
And the RBA has put out its half-yearly financial stability review, and it's particularly concerned about those borrowers who entered the housing market with huge debt-to-income ratios.
Look, absolutely. But I think the issue here is not about the default of the borrower, because simply when you think about it, a consumer actually has built up a lot of savings rates. It is running still at high, over 10% of GDP being saved. So the borrowing position is okay, but the problem is interest rate at current projected level. In the next couple of years, variable interest rate could double. That means it's actually not about the default, it's more about the consumption. Consumer will run out of money given the amount of the inflation and interest rate increases. It's going to be quite challenging for consumer.
Zhongbei Liu, as always, great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
They're young, cool and unlicensed. The so-called finfluencers have been handing out free wealth advice to an eager Gen Y clientele. Now, the corporate cop is cracking down, warning internet advisors could face a $1 million fine or jail time if they don't get a licence, as Rihanna Whitson reports.
You don't need a 20% deposit to get into a property.
Alex Nikolic has earned as much as $4,000 a month from talking about money and investing on social media. She's what's known as a finfluencer.
For me, there were sponsorship opportunities, not with financial products, like with other brand partners that I've worked with.
As young people pile into investing, they've been turning to social media for free tips and advice. A crackdown by the corporate regulator means finfluencers will need to be licensed to provide financial advice, or risk a $1 million fine and even jail time.
If you're a finfluencer and you're providing financial advice, then we'd expect you to have a licence. In fact, you're required to have a licence.
Nearly 30% of young people have reported following at least one finfluencer on social media. Almost 2/3 of them having changed at least one of their financial behaviours as a result.
People complain about bad advice. They complain about, I guess, the conflicts not being appropriately managed, and they complain about misleading conduct.
Financial advisors have long been calling for finfluencers to be properly trained.
If anyone's giving advice who is not licensed, the investor has no access to consumer protections. I just wanted to show you.
Judith Fox is concerned about the illegal activity of some finfluencers who'd been promoting what's known as pump and dump scams.
You had some finfluencers who were talking up particular stocks, which they probably owned, and then people would pile in to buy it at the high price, and then the person would make a lot of money and then dump the stock. So the others would be left, with a valueless stock.
Dr. Angel Zong says ASIC's new guidelines kills the business model of finfluencers.
I think this is a wake-up call for the finfluencers because they can no longer provide recommendations for financial products and services without a license.
The corporate watchdog's guidelines don't cover cryptocurrencies because in Australia they're still unregulated and not a financial product. Last year, Australians lost almost $130 million to crypto scams.
So if you do invest in those products, you're effectively on your own.
Experts are concerned the crackdown could mean some finfluencers switch to talking about crypto.
I would say that's actually the elephant in the room, which means there should be regulations for this digital finance space first in order for ASIC to take the next move towards crypto.
Alex says most influencers have good intentions.
Hope that helps. I really hope that people don't stop talking about money and debt, because I think we have a moral imperative to make financial literacy as accessible and easy to understand as possible for young Australians.
Alex is now looking into getting qualified to keep her online following.
And that's all from Close of Business. For more on those stories, go to our website and catch The Business Monday to Thursday evenings at 8:45 Eastern on the ABC News channel and after the late news on ABC TV. I'm Alicia Barry. Thanks for watching.
It's on.
For the latest on the federal election, go to ABC News Digital.
Policy announcements and how they impact you.
Profiles of every electorate, including yours.
Anthony Green's guide to the key seats.
You Ask, We Answer is back, and you can see what other Australians are asking.
There's our new Get Ready to Vote checklist, plus live blogs and notifications so you won't miss a thing.
For election news that matters to you, go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes or download the ABC News app.
Inside the secret world of Israel's ultra-Orthodox. While men worship, wives are expected to serve.
We'll meet some of the men who feel they should never have to work.
אני מכוון להיות בן אדם שיודע ותשאל אותי בכל הלכה שלא יהיה בארון ואני אוכל לענות לך, זה החלום שלי.
But the pressure is mounting for them to adopt modern ways.
A culture war between Jews themselves.
Foreign Correspondent, Thursday at 8 on ABC and ABC iView.
We are having a Malakuta election.
We feel we know best about what we need.
A small town taking back control.
Everybody in Malakuta is talking about the election.
There'll be no chance that they'll choose me.
In a groundbreaking experiment.
No one's going to get exactly what they want, and nor should they.
In this town, you are damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Everybody's terrified that the lunatics will take over the asylum.
People's Republic of Malakuta. Tuesday at 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView. Mysterious, suspenseful, thrilling. New drama on ABC iView.
Who are you?
I'm a bad person who's trying to be good.
What you did dishonors all cops.
When a man is prey to his emotions, he is not his own master.
There's been a report of inappropriate behaviour.
This life, this is all we need. You don't need to prove yourself to anyone.
To stream the best drama for free, log in to ABC iView.
The federal election campaign officially underway, with both leaders outlining their pitches to voters.
It's a choice between a strong future and an uncertain one.
We are a great country, but we can be even better.
Evidence that Russian forces used civilians as human shields in Ukraine. And Max Verstappen's Australian Grand Prix comes to an abrupt end, paving the way for Ferrari.
Magic in Melbourne. Charles Leclerc wins the Australian Grand Prix for Ferrari.
Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm David Chow. The speculation is over. Australians will head to the polls on Saturday, May the 21st. The Prime Minister announced the election date after visiting the Governor-General in Canberra this morning, meaning we're set for 6 weeks of campaigning. Scott Morrison's pitch is his government is not perfect, but one to stick with in uncertain times. For Anthony Albanese, it's that Australians deserve better, and he's ready to lead.
For the second time in his prime ministership, the underdog swept through the gates and around the grounds of Government House, seeking vice-regal consent to call an election. He got it, sending 17 million Australians to the polls.
This election is about you, no one else. It's about our country and it's about its future.
With his character under attack and popularity in decline, Scott Morrison's trying not to make this election about him, but rather his government's record.
It's a choice between a strong future and an uncertain one. It's a choice between a government you know and a Labor opposition that you don't.
Here you go, close up.
A 26-year veteran of federal parliament, the Labor leader's still defining himself to voters.
I am who I am. I'm a working class lad. I'm comfortable in a boardroom and I'm comfortable in a pub.
Anthony Albanese's ditched the big taxing, big spending agenda that Labor took to the last election, adopting a smaller target strategy focused on hot-button issues like childcare and aged care.
I'm ready, we are ready, and Australia is ready for a better future.
But it's personality, not policies, that will likely define this campaign. Scott Morrison handing his opponents more ammunition.
Will Alan Tudge be in your cabinet if your government is returned then?
Alan Tudge is still in my cabinet.
Fact check, he's not. He quit cabinet in March.
It just shows the chaos that's there, even when people step aside.
Scott Morrison's chosen the latest possible date to hold this election, an indication he thinks he can grind his opponent down in coast-to-coast campaigning over 6 weeks. But time and incumbency appear to be more fickle factors now than they were during the pandemic, especially when Labor's out to present this current government as an almost decade-old coalition enterprise, not just the 3.5 years Mr Morrison's presided over.
Our government is not perfect. We've never claimed to be. But we are upfront.
Acknowledging the government's flaws, the Prime Minister's appealing to voters to stick with what they know.
There is so much at stake for Australia and our future.
While the Labor leader says there's no time like now to change.
This is our time to seize the opportunities that are before us.
On May 21.
With the date set, the campaign's officially kicked off.
In the words of the great Ramones, hey ho, let's go.
And judgment from voters awaits.
Thank you very much.
Jane Norman, ABC News, Canberra.
Now let's take a look at some of the key seats. Here's ABC data analyst Casey Briggs.
If you want to know where Mr Morrison and Mr Albanese are going to spend a lot of their time in the next 6 weeks, well, perhaps the best thing we can do is look back at this Clayton's campaign we've had, if you like, in the last few months about where the unofficial campaign has been fought. And the 3 states that we're seeing time and time again people visiting, leaders visiting, are New South Wales, Queensland and WA. New South Wales, Sydney is where Mr Albanese started, or has spent today, first this afternoon launching his bid for re-election at the Commonwealth offices in Sydney, but he actually started the day in the seat of Reid, a government-held seat on a margin of 3.2% that, you know, they would be hoping to pick up if they are to form government at come May 21. But the Prime Minister, all of these pins are locations that either Mr Morrison or Mr Albanese have been in the past week. So you can see there are a lot of pins on the board. They've been a lot of places. The Prime Minister heading to Shortland, heading to Dobell, heading to Robertson, all up the New South Wales Central Coast, but also seats in Sydney like the seat of Banks, as well as the seat of Parramatta, and even the seat of McMahon. So lots to play for in New South Wales and Sydney in particular. We've seen Mr Albanese spending a lot of time in Brisbane and the southeast of Queensland, seats like Lilly, which is a marginal Labor-held seat, but they'd also be hoping to pick up seats like Dixon, held by the Defence Minister Peter Dutton, the seat of Longman, held by Terry Young on a margin of 3.3%. Queensland as a whole is actually a state that swung to the government last election. That's what helped Scott Morrison win that miracle victory that he called it, at least. Regional Queensland seats like Flynn would be ones that the Labor Party would be hoping to make some inroads in, which swung toward the coalition last time. And that third state that I mentioned is WA, where, again, Anthony Albanese has spent some time this week visiting a couple of seats. One is Hasluck on a margin of 5.4% held by the government. The other is the seat of Swan, stopping a couple of times there during the week as well. So they are probably some of the places that, you know, if you live there and you're excited about politics, great, you might be seeing a lot of election campaigning in the weeks to come. If you're not so excited, I'm sorry, you'll just have to brace for it because the campaign is coming your way.
Ukrainian authorities say they're preparing for another Russian offensive. It follows the release of satellite images showing a Russian military convoy moving through eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian ambassador to the United Kingdom is warning the worst may be yet to come.
We expect that the forces which have been thrown away from Kyiv will regroup and resupply and will go somewhere east and south of Ukraine. The most dangerous parts is the Odessa port of Odessa, which is our southern ports, so many of them in Black Sea, and they are totally blocked right now. This teeny city of Mariupol in the Sea of Azov, and all east of Ukraine. That's where we will see probably the next battles, and I'm afraid, very bloody ones.
And Ukrainian officials say they've uncovered more evidence of brutal Russian aggression. It follows reports from the village of Yahudne, where civilians say they were held captive and used as human shields. The Prosecutor General of Ukraine says her country has identified thousands of cases of alleged war crimes.
We started 5,600 cases in Ukraine only about war crimes. We have our anchor case from these 5,600 cases, 02 cases, sorry. And we have our main anchor case where we have 500 suspects. It's a case about aggression crime, aggression Russian Federation against Ukraine.
French voters are casting their ballots in the opening round of a presidential race, which could become a cliffhanger. Emmanuel Macron has a fight on his hands from far-right challenger Marine Le Pen, who's been galvanised by a slick election campaign. 49 million people are eligible to decide which 2 of 12 candidates should take part in the runoff vote. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has been ousted from office after losing a vote of no confidence in Parliament. Opposition supporters danced in celebration on the streets of Islamabad after the late-night vote. The former cricket great has been accused of poor economic management and for clamping down on dissent during his term as leader. Imran Khan was elected Prime Minister in 2018, promising to fight corruption and to improve the economy. The 69-year-old has claimed there's a US-led conspiracy against him, and his supporters say they'll fight to have him reinstated. An interim Prime Minister will be appointed to serve until the elections are held late next year. And there's little sign of China changing its strict zero-tolerance approach to COVID-19, ordering all 19 million people in the southern city of Guangzhou into mandatory testing, following just 2 cases. Further north in Shanghai, videos showing civilians fed up with the strict pandemic measures are circulating on Chinese social media. Another shows a drone urging residents to comply with COVID restrictions and to control their soul's desire for freedom. Shanghai's 25 million residents remain under a strict citywide lockdown that began last week. There are widespread reports of limited access to food and medicine. Harsh restrictions have failed to contain the outbreak, with the city reporting more than 23,000 new infections in the latest round of testing. The Sydney Roosters have won their first NRLW premiership, defeating the Dragons 16-4. It was third time lucky for the Roosters after losing 2 grand finals in recent seasons.
An all New South Wales decider hosted in Queensland. Still, 7,855 fans were eager to witness the first NRLW grand final to be played in the Sunshine State. And the crowd didn't have to wait long for the first try of the afternoon.
And the Dragons, inside 90 seconds, open the scoring on grand final day.
Shortly after, the Dragons would lose playmaker Talia Fuimeono to the bin after a high shot on Bridie Parker, who suffered a serious knee injury. The Roosters tried time after time to score, but couldn't break the Dragons' defence.
Again, they come up with amazing defence.
But the points would finally come in the second half.
The Roosters tied up in the grand final.
The Roosters would add another 10 minutes later.
Look out, here goes Isabel Kelly!
But it was the match winner with just minutes to go, which was clouded by controversy.
Player down, and they must stop play. Oh no, Higgins! But this doesn't look right. That is a Roosters trainer saying, let's stop play. Next minute, the Roosters score a try.
And the last try,
Not really sure, if that's an obstruction or not, but at the end of the day, the Roosters were a better team.
The girls were just outstanding, so proud of them.
Jessica Stewart, ABC News, Redcliffe.
Ferrari's Charles Leclerc has won this year's Australian Formula One Grand Prix in emphatic fashion in the race's return to Melbourne. It was a tough day for reigning world champion Max Verstappen, who was forced to retire mid-race.
After the longest wait, Ferrari is once again back on top in Australia.
This one means a lot, clearly.
There was a sense of anticipation as Formula One returned to Melbourne, waiting for a race 3 years in the making.
Melbourne, we welcome the world back to Australia. The Australian Grand Prix is go. We're racing in Melbourne.
It didn't take long for the revised track to claim its first victim as Carlos Sainz's horror weekend continued. A strong start from Lewis Hamilton pushed him up the order as the 7-time world champion battled with Red Bull's Sergio Perez.
What a move!
A back and forth that was cut short due to a safety car after 2-time winner in Australia Sebastian Vettel crashed out.
So Aston Martin just to complete their shocking weekend.
Ferrari's newfound pace this season continued to pay dividends as Charles Leclerc held off a challenge from the world champion Max Verstappen.
Leclerc still has it, just
before his Red Bull machinery fouled him.
That's some weird fluid. Yeah. Everything is itself.
Mercedes pair of Hamilton and George Russell started to find their form in a battle with Red Bull's Sergio Perez, but there was no stopping Leclerc, the 24-year-old claiming his first win in Australia and the second for the season.
The man from Monaco, magic in Melbourne, Charles Leclerc wins the Australian Grand Prix for Ferrari.
McLaren teammates Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris largely battled it out with each other, Norris finishing 5th and the Australian cheered home in 6th. After a 2-year absence, fans certainly have turned out in force. A record number of F1 fans have made their way to Albert Park, with more than 400,000 making their way through the gates over the 4 days. And with a crowd of 128,000 today, the Grand Prix is back on the podium of major events. Fraser Fife, ABC News, Melbourne.
Now let's check the weather in the capitals for Monday. Sunny in Brisbane, a late shower in Sydney and Canberra, a clearing shower in Melbourne, cloudy in Hobart and Adelaide, a clearing shower in Perth, and sunny in Darwin, a top of 35 degrees. And that's the latest from ABC News. Remember, you can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm David Chow. Thanks for watching.
Today on Landline, the end of peace rates.
It pushes the average hourly rate or the expectation under peace rate to $30 an hour, which in anyone's language is a lot of money for picking fruit.
I don't think there's any question that this is going to have an impact on prices.
Restoring reefs in Port Phillip Bay.
Putting back into nature, which is probably the most rewarding thing for us, and it makes us all feel good about coming to work and knowing that we're doing something right for the environment.
And from nursing to farming.
I'm not leaving unless I'm, pulled out of here in my coffin. I want a road named after us, even if I have to make that our driveway.
Hello, I'm Pip Courtney. In a radical shake-up, fruit and vegetable pickers must be guaranteed a minimum wage from later this month. Changes to the Horticulture Award mean farm workers will no longer be paid just on the amount they pick, known as piece rates. National Rural reporter Kath Sullivan takes a look at the effects these changes will have on an industry already crying out for workers.
Harvest's underway in Victoria's Goulburn Valley. The fruit is bountiful, but a tight labour market means the workers are not.
The type of work, it is quite physically demanding, and also a challenge for us is that we really only attract workers for 2 to 3 months of the year.
Michael Crisera from Fruit Growers Victoria says finding people to pick the fruit is one of the industry's biggest concerns and costs.
Labour costs would probably make up to 60% of our growing costs, to be honest. It's huge. It's the main cost in our industry.
While some pay workers by an hourly rate, he says the majority of growers here are paying pickers according to how much fruit they harvest, paying by what's called the piece rate.
For example, in our game, in the fruit game, we'll pay around the $50 a bin for them to get it off, and then that, over the day, depending how many bins they pick, that's how much they get paid.
Growers like knowing a fixed cost and say it incentivises pickers to work harder.
The competent picker would probably average around the $250 a day sort of thing, around $250 to $300 sometimes. Really good pickers can pick up, make up around the $400 a day.
When Isaiah started picking, it was hard going.
I got sore with my muscle.
Now in his 4th year in Australia, he finds the fruit comes faster.
It depends on good fruits. When more crops, I pick 10 or 8 bins a day using a cherry picker.
The jobs allowed him to buy a taxi and build a home for his mum back in Samoa.
I like this job. When I got experience, that's easy for us.
But that's not everyone's experience. A recent Senate inquiry heard from workers on a Victorian strawberry farm that felt let down by the piece rate system.
Ai afia o matou tulafa inga luenga le reito le trei o matou pikina mo le seleni o matou sailia tolu tala le kau le trei tolu tala lua tolu tala tolu to pa ula tolu tala lua pe a fa le tonu le fuala au le anga le fuala au o le mo lunga la vol pusa mo te pikina le aso o le ono sfu pa o mai lalo tolu sfu fast food fesusu ya ile fa pena ya le mo lunga o matou tupe mo le aso.
Unions say the piece rate left some workers with incredibly low wages.
We've seen the horrible examples like up in Coffs Harbour with workers getting paid as little as $3 an hour. We've seen cases, I've seen personally, met with workers who have had their piece rate change on a daily basis. And that is their piece rate is changed to try and drive down wages for that worker.
Piece rates are commonly used in crops that can't be mechanically harvested, things like citrus, berries and mangoes.
We've seen countless examples of exploitation right across our growing regions of workers, not just overseas workers working on our different visa programs, but local workers as well.
Following a union-led appeal, the Fair Work Commission ruled that piece rates aren't working. So the rules are changing. From April 28, horticulture workers must be guaranteed a minimum hourly wage, no matter how much produce they pick. For casuals, that's about $25 an hour. Workers can still earn a piece rate as an incentive. The average competent worker must be allowed to earn 15% above the hourly rate. That's roughly $30 an hour.
I would imagine that there are some farmers out there saying, well, that's how we've been applying it. But unfortunately, there's not enough of them. And what we want to see is our members and workers in the industry being able to go to a farm and have some certainty that if they've worked X amount of hours per week, they'll at least get that. If they're more productive, if they can harvest more, pick more, be punnet, buckets, crates, whatever it might be, that they can earn some more on top. Now, that's going to make them more productive. That's a better outcome for the farmer, and it's a good outcome for our members, so long as we've got that safety net in place. We have a very strong position that anyone who does not pay people properly and treat workers fairly needs to leave the industry. It's just simply unacceptable, and it undermines growers doing the right thing. And it's not limited to piece rate. Like, obviously piece rate has received a lot of attention and focus, but if there are employers or contractors who are looking to treat people poorly, they seem to find new and unique ways to do that.
Members of the Australian Fresh Produce Alliance account for more than half the industry's turnover and more than a third of fresh fruit and vegetable exports. It wants better policing of the rules to be part of any conversation about piece rates.
The clear requirement that all workers must be paid a minimum provides an enforceable standard. The issue is that we need regulators to enforce and to ensure that no one can operate how they like, that they are in fact operating consistent with the law. So the piece rate decision is a very important step forward, but it must be backed up by compliance and enforcement.
Michael Rogers says the changes, which come with new record-keeping obligations for growers, mean some businesses will need to restructure.
The implications for the decision are far-reaching for those employers who haven't been paying well. For those employers who have been paying well, it pushes the average hourly rate or the expectation under piece rate to $30 an hour, which in anyone's language is a lot of money for picking fruit.
I don't think there's any question that this is going to have an impact on prices.
One of the reasons Victorian Farmers Federation President Emma Germano expects the Fair Work changes will increase costs for farmers and consumers is due to slower workers.
We're going to have to ensure that those slower workers, and they might be slower workers for lots of different reasons, who were happy to come along on farm and get paid what would be less than the minimum hourly wage. Essentially, a farmer is going to have to make the decision now as to whether or not they accept that worker on the farm because it is going to simply be costing them more.
Farmers worry that could further compound the worker shortage, estimated to be in the thousands nationally. Here on Emma Germano's Gippsland farm, the workers picking cauliflower are paid an hourly rate. But whether it's hourly or piece rate, she says shouldn't really matter. And there's a bigger question at hand.
So how much we pay to have our produce picked and packed on our farms is almost irrelevant if the farmer is getting paid a fair price. Supermarkets simply have to purchase from those growers that they know are doing the right thing. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what the system is. It doesn't matter what the minimum number is. It doesn't matter how you calculate piece rate. If it's not complied with and enforced, then it's all a moot point.
We're really concerned that there seems to be a lot of focus on making sure that everybody's being paid correctly, but doesn't seem to be any pressure on the supermarkets to make sure that they pay our growers correctly.
If the big price setters, be it Coles and Woolies, are setting prices which mean the only sustainable way that a farmer can operate is to rip off workers, then that is a problem. And we're working with the retailers to try and fix up any problems in their supply chain. And we want to work with the farmers to make sure that they are getting a fair price so that our members can get a fair wage.
Woolworths, Coles and Aldi were all invited to be a part of this story, but no spokespeople were available for interview. Woolworths says it works to strike the right balance so customers can have access to quality, affordable produce and suppliers receive a fair market price. It also says it sets clear expectations for its suppliers to uphold the rights of workers and conducts regular due diligence. Coles says it's committed to the fair treatment of all workers in the supply chain, and its suppliers are required to comply with an ethical sourcing policy, and that suppliers are monitored through engaging external auditors. Aldi says it's got a clear code of conduct and standards which its suppliers must follow. It expects its suppliers and business partners to comply with all applicable local laws as their first obligation. Back at Emma Germano's farm, she says growers are still confused about the new laws and many are seeking clarity. It's particularly stressful for those businesses that will be mid-harvest when the rules change. But she is also hopeful that the piece rates issue could be the catalyst for a broader conversation.
When we see dollar punnets of strawberries, cauliflowers, available for purchase for $1, these sorts of things are not sustainable for the industry. Essentially, if farmers don't get paid enough for their produce, the only shortcuts that can be taken are the cost of labour and the cost to the environment. So it's great that we're actually starting to have that conversation and people can really appreciate the true price of food.
The
The decades-long partnership between Australian live cattle exporters and Indonesian buyers is being put to the test. Continuing high cattle prices and a massive shortage of stock has created what's been called the worst trading conditions in 30 years. As Landline's Christy O'Brien reports, it comes at a time when international rival beef producers are eyeing off Asian markets.
In the space of a few hours, 3,000 head of cattle will be loaded here onto 16 cattle trucks, freighted to the Darwin port and off on an export boat to Indonesia.
G'day mate, there you go.
Excellent. You right to roll, Smoothie? It's a type of logistical wizardry that Kelly White thrives on.
It is, and I actually probably think that's one of the most exciting things about live export is it's really quick.
She runs the yards with husband Don about an hour and a half south of Darwin.
So the cattle come in for 2 clear days before they go on a boat, and basically that's used to feed them, water them, let them get over their trip, make sure they're all in good order, you don't have any sick or lame, put them into their lines and their categories for shipping. So it's a quarantine facility.
The family established an export depot at Bridge Creek Station in 2014, in addition to the cattle properties they already owned and leased.
Over the years, I don't know, in ag, there's just constant ups and downs, you know, like interest rates really high, it will flood, you'll get burnt out, you'll be in a drought, so you're just constantly looking at ways to even it all out.
They are in the rare position of being beef producers as well as running holding yards.
It's probably a really good place to be because, at the moment prices are really high. And that's really hard for exporters to operate in that sort of market. There wouldn't be a lot of profit in it, I dare say. So the volume through the yards is less. But then on the other hand, as producers, we're getting prices I've never seen for our cattle. So yeah, we're very lucky that we can operate in both sort of areas. And then when prices come back or sort of even out, then the volume in the yards will pick up, which makes up for the lack of income from the cattle side of things.
The import arm of the cattle trade is certainly hoping for that shift. Major importer and old hat, Dicky Aduaso, says at the moment it's the toughest climate he's experienced in 30 years he's been in the industry. He's partnered with Australian cattle giant CPC and runs 2 feedlots, one in Jakarta, the other in the northern part of Sumatra.
It started dwindling, the numbers, and then the price of cattle from Australia is quite expensive at the moment. So some of our competitors actually has ceased operation at the moment, but we still are in operation at the moment.
From the heady highs of 2014, when 493,000 cattle were shipped from Darwin, to about half that in 2021, there's certainly been a hefty reduction in trade. To this shipment a few weeks ago, where the cattle were much harder to source and costly. When the pandemic began 2 years ago, there were fears about what it would mean for live exports, with such ironclad borders in place. The trade, however, largely held up, although the toll on the ground was hard.
To tell you the truth, the COVID really hit us very bad in our operation as well in our hearts. I mean, our feedlot, we lost about 3 people during COVID. We were one of the operations that really imposed a strict measurement on the COVID situation.
But it's not the pandemic that's prompted worries about the longevity of the trade. The industry is in the middle of a perfect storm. There's a number of factors that have led to this real shortage of cattle in Australia, harking back as far as 2011 with drought and flood really hitting that national herd. The problem is, at the end of the supply chain in Indonesia, there's only so much that importers and consumers are willing to pay. Prices are fetching upwards of $5.50 per kilo for live steers. Record prices never seen before. Importers are also dealing with the soaring cost and growing limits on feed sources.
They are suffering quite heavily right now because there is no trading margin at all in Operation Indonesia. It's more on an operation excellence and operation margin in Indonesia, like a feeding margin. But also the feeding margin has been quite eroded at the moment because of the price of commodity.
For a long time, Indonesian feedlots had access to an abundance of low-cost agricultural products and byproducts like pineapple waste and coffee seed pulp. It's a fattening advantage that Northern Australia doesn't have, and what has made the partnership so mutually beneficial. But in recent times, the price of feed ingredients has gone through the roof due to increased export demand for the same products. Improved processing, which has made many of those former waste products viable for human consumption, and Indonesian government policies geared towards promoting self-sufficiency of food. It's a double whammy, having to pay record prices for livestock and feed. There's certainly no overnight fix. A reduction in cattle prices depends on building up Australia's herd, but that's years away. In the meantime, there's uneasiness about whether there'll be a future trade. The Indonesian government has talked about opening up the door to importing even more frozen Indian buffalo meat. Brazil has also aggressively marked its space in the market.
The government decided to open it, and hopefully another of this crisis will not jeopardize also our mutual beneficial trade.
Brooke Barkler also works in Indonesia when there isn't a pandemic, and is adamant the trade can come out the other side of this stronger. It'll just require some consolidation and improvement in efficiencies.
I think the way that the feedlotters in Indonesia will respond to that is actually just by increasing efficiencies, and whether that be through some more investment into infrastructure and processes and procedures, perhaps adopting some more Western-style feeding methods, so perhaps processing grains.
This will be the focus of a Nuffield scholarship she's hoping to complete when the world returns to normal. In her research, she also wants to explore the socio-economic value of the trade. Last year alone at the feedlot she manages, it imported 70,000 cattle or 84 million meals.
Around the feedlot in South Sumatra, one of our feedlots, there's probably 500,000 people in a 10 to 15 kilometre radius, and all those people are sort of impacted somehow by the feedlot operations. So we have 600 staff. We probably support a family for every 5 cattle that we import, which is pretty amazing. And then we have truck drivers of cattle and commodities, people that supply goods and services to the feedlot, butchers, wet market traders, and the biggest one of all is the commodity supply chain. Just the amount of people that are have employment through that.
Landline was in Indonesia just after the newly minted free trade agreement was signed with Australia in 2020. Under the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the cattle industry was a major beneficiary, securing duty-free access for 575,000 cattle in year one. Optimism was high, and there was much talk about the rising middle class and the influence protein would have on diet patterns and consumer purchasing. Spending habits are also altering, and it means consumers will spend an additional $1 trillion a year by 2030. Brooke says while competitors might be hovering, consumer patterns remain pretty steadfast, and boxed beef from India or Brazil has its pitfalls. She says wet markets and live cattle still have an intrinsic cultural advantage. With its 260 million strong Muslim population, halal preference requires animals to be processed in their country. Refrigeration is also an issue, with an estimated nearly 50 million Indonesians not having access to power.
And, you know, our long-term relationships have been created over the last 30 years, and I don't think they're going anywhere in a hurry either, and that's a really, you know, important part of our trade. But at the end of the day, live cattle has a competitive advantage over box beef, that we have the product that the consumers actually, you know, prefer, in that it's, you know, produced locally by the local butcher, and it's in line with their culture and traditions.
She says there is undoubtedly increased wealth, with Indonesia tipped to become the world's 4th biggest economy by 2050.
I think we've seen some packaged products, a bit like Coles and Woolworths here, go into supermarkets, into Transmart in Indonesia, but the big growth is in the traditional markets. And I think before we see consumers shift towards shopping in supermarkets, we will probably see more of a modernisation of the traditional markets. So perhaps some better hygiene, some more branding, and, you know, maybe some technology and upgrades like refrigeration and, you know, maybe the infrastructure of the actual markets themselves.
At Bridge Creek Station, they might not have put all their eggs in one basket, but they're still hoping things return to a more sustainable footing for everyone involved.
I hope so. You know, this is something that I hope our kids take over. So, you know, that's where I see live export. I don't, you know, it's always going to have its issues. It's always going to have its people that don't agree with it. But I think it's our job to make it as robust and as strong industry as we can, and that's things like looking after our animals, looking after our staff, looking after the country, so that it has got longevity.
Hello, I'm Lucy Barber. Federal Labor has given the first taste of its election promises for the bush. Anthony Albanese has told the National Farmers Federation conference that a Labor government would commit $500 million to boost agriculture, forestry and fisheries. That money would come from the party's $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund and be used to provide loans and investment guarantees.
This will encourage investment in value-adding and growing exports. It will help diversify the sector, and it will open up new possibilities for trade, and it will help create more jobs in the region.
Labor's also promising $400 million to improve mobile phone coverage and $20 million for a national audit of black spots. But beyond that, Labor hasn't made any of its agricultural policies clear, including whether the party would phase out live sheep exports, as it promised to do if it won the last election. Staying with Labor's commitments, an Anthony Albanese government would ensure that 450 gigalitres of water would be returned to the environment under the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. The federal and state water ministers previously agreed that water could only be returned if basin communities didn't take a hit. But the opposition says it would deliver on the original commitment.
Because if you don't have those environmental flows, the system will die. That is why it is so important for South Australia that we deliver on the 450 gigalitres.
Federal Labor hasn't ruled out buying back water from farmers, but says it wants to avoid that if possible. Global mining giant BHP will bankroll a $200 million wind farm in Western Australia's south. It's the latest in a string of major renewable energy projects to be unveiled across the country. The power generated will be sold to Nickel West, an arm of BHP. Industry experts are tipping more to come as big business, rather than governments, increasingly drive Australia's push towards net zero carbon emissions.
Businesses like BHP across Australia are moving ahead with their decarbonisation plans. They're actually getting ahead of the policymakers.
A spokeswoman for the Federal Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, insists Australia's cutting its emissions faster than any other major exporting nation. Millions of Australian grapes are being left to rot on the ground as a Chinese boycott of Australian wine causes demand to wither. The trade dispute means wine exports have fallen by 30%, leaving some growers with no choice but to dump their harvests. 130 tonnes of these Shiraz grapes have been harvested straight onto the ground because no winery would take them.
Due to the trade dispute and the imposition of the punitive tariffs on the Australian wine. So that means that $1.2 billion market is now closed.
China's boycott of Australian red wine also means less red is being made.
Talk is there could be 15,000 tonnes left on the vines this year in this region, which is no good. And there's certainly a lot of bulk wine around as well. Millions of litres of wine in storage really hasn't got a home at this stage.
A new interim free trade agreement with India could help reduce the dependence on China. It's opened up big market opportunities for some industries, but others have been shut out. Australian wine exporters and sheep farmers are among those who will see tariffs cut significantly, but the dairy and grain industries want better deals. The final agreement is expected to be signed later this year. And that's Landline News.
Our marine environment has suffered since European settlement. Shellfish reefs in particular have often been wiped out by dredging and overfishing. But the Nature Conservancy, along with the federal government and other partners, is now rebuilding them. Landline's Tim Lee reports on the most ambitious reef restoration project attempted in Australia.
Horseshoe-shaped and almost 2,000 kilometres in size, Port Phillip Bay fans southwards from Melbourne, Australia's second largest city. Since European settlement in 1835, the bay has been a valuable port and an all too convenient drain. Sadly, for decades, it was one of the most degraded inland waterways. Loss of onshore vegetation and industrial, domestic and agricultural pollution have all taken a toll. But redemption is underway.
We used to have these natural shellfish reefs all around our coastline, and over the years they've just disappeared with oyster fishing and other effects, but we're putting them back.
Restoring these vast underwater seascapes is one of the most ambitious marine conservation efforts ever seen in Australia, with $20 million in federal funding committed to it.
Our Commonwealth investment has produced 40 hectares of shellfish reefs, and it's truly a fantastic program.
Well, Port Phillip Bay was the first project in Australia where we restored shellfish reefs.
Work began in 2017 at 4 sites across the bay. Today, we're setting sail from Clifton Springs, headed to a reef site about a nautical mile offshore. Below on the sea floor is a newly constructed reef covering 2 hectares. These bags hold the new life that will make their home here. Clinging to these scallop shells are tiny juvenile oysters. Months later, it's time to check on how things are progressing. Today we're on the eastern side of Port Phillip Bay, setting sail from Mount Martha and headed to a newly built reef site just out from the seaside town of Dramana. Within a few short years, this artificial structure has become a haven for all manner of marine life.
John, what have you seen down there?
Oh, this was amazing down there. It's been a while since we've dived it. Plenty of fish.
Great to see the mussels starting to form the veneer over the top of the reef, and oysters sticking up out of the reef starting to filter, and got a great shot of a giant cuttlefish, which is amazing to see.
It's said that the city of Melbourne was built on gold and the fabulous prosperity it brought to colonial Australia. But you could rightly say the foundations of the city's grand buildings were built by the shells of millions of marine creatures.
When first Europeans came along, they probably would have run their boats up onto shore and found this great food source that looked identical to the Ostrea species in Europe. So that was a real driver of their loss. So they were also dredged out to form and build the buildings of colonial Victoria and other states.
They also burnt oyster shells and live oysters in lime kilns. So a lot of the historic buildings in Melbourne and elsewhere are built on the back of these shellfish reefs.
Chief victim in all of this was the native flat, or mud oyster, known as the Angazi. The impetus for this ambitious restoration came from this man, long-time fisherman and yacht club member Bob Pearce. He recalls bayside piers and pylons studded with blue mussels.
To get the oysters was after a storm usually, and the millions of mussels and oysters washed ashore, and we just go over in knee-deep water and fill the bucket up, and oysters, you know, around about that big, the flat oysters. Most people don't know that there are native oysters. They only know the ones that they see in the supermarkets.
Bob, now 76, grew up in Albert Park, a suburb by the bay, but later moved across town. When he returned, years later, he was alarmed by what he found.
In the 1960s, they had a dredge industry for scallops, and basically over the years the scallop beds were destroyed, and then they started dredging the shellfish reefs and just did terrible damage. It was unrecoverable naturally. What's going on at the moment, what we're doing is basically helping Mother Nature basically to recover the reefs. It used to bother me a lot, and I had a talk with the club one night and we decided we would like to do something about it.
That's right. Bob Pearce from Albert Park Yachting and Angling Club called me about 10 years ago and said, Simon, I'm really keen to get a project up and running in the bay to restore oyster reefs and mussel reefs. And at that stage, I knew nothing about sort of shellfish reefs.
We've got a lot of older club members that have, you know, they agreed. So it's been fantastic to see that in action and to now see the fruition of it. It's fantastic too.
Drawing on historical records and local knowledge, the marine scientists were able to plot the sea floor.
That was back in 2015, and here we are 7 years later, and we've restored 12 hectares of shellfish reefs with, you know, partnerships with the Australian government, Victorian government, Albert Park Yachting and Angling Club and many other partners.
Since then, the Yachting and Angling Club has also tipped in $350,000 in funding.
Since 2017, this project has built more than 12 hectares of reefs across this bay. The ultimate goal in time is to build more than 100 hectares.
Some of the older fishermen still have a lot of knowledge, particularly of the blue mussel reefs that were in the bay. And that's really what stemmed the rebuilding of the reefs in Port Phillip Bay, was this recognition of their loss and the important things that they can do for the environment. So filter, be fish factories, and then, yeah, just bringing back a lost ecosystem to the bay.
And this is where it all begins, a fish factory of another sort, the Victorian government-run marine hatchery at Queenscliff, on the western side of the bay.
We produce a lot of shellfish for industry and the aquaculture industry, but it's the opportunity now to be able to produce for the environment, and knowing that that is going back into the environment to rebuild these really, really endangered structures out there. And, you know, it creates habitat for recreational species. It creates habitat for a lot of smaller species that might feed off them. It's just, yeah, it's the ecosystem that we're repairing, and it's probably the most rewarding thing for us.
This is really the linchpin of the restoration operation.
For half the year, the hatchery produces mussels and then oysters in the warmer months. They reach their breeding peak around Christmas, but the scientists here feed them and fatten them up on a special nutrient-rich mixture.
So that they're ready to spawn a little bit before Christmas, and then we can make use of that time over Christmas as well, of their natural conditioning, and we'll spawn from there as well.
The minute oyster larvae are raised in these tanks of seawater, infused with nutrient-rich algae. When they're big enough, they attach themselves to a reused oyster or scallop shell.
Right in there.
Yeah, I can
see them all there.
Yeah.
They're cleaned up and bagged up and put into our tanks. That's what we use to settle those baby oysters onto.
Pretty even coverage.
Even coverage, but coverage from shell to shell as well. So we've got not only this one, but the next cell along, you've got another 20, and you've got another 20 there.
So we recycle shells from seafood wholesalers, restaurants, craft breweries through the Shuck Don't Chuck project. So we build a reef base out of either limestone rubble or a combination of limestone rubble and shell.
And oysters and mussels are really the bedrock.
So they'll cement together and grow on top of each other over time, so you won't see that reef base.
Globally, it's estimated that 85% of shellfish reefs have been lost. Port Phillip Bay is no exception, and re-establishing Angazi oysters has been a scientific challenge.
They're not like your typical oyster. They're quite cryptic, in fact, and we don't know a lot about the way that they behave, a lot about how they reproduce. So there's a lot of guesswork going on in there. We can't condition these things like we normally would with oysters. We have to wait until they're ready. And so we bring them in with natural condition, and they're a brooding oyster as well.
But persistence is paying off.
We started off with very, very little success. You know, we maybe have got 300,000 out there at initial stages. Today, fast forward 6 years, we're producing 5 million, and, you know, we could probably go 10 if we really, really wanted to, but we're limited by space.
Today, the latest batch of juvenile shellfish is ready to be dispersed, a process called seeding.
Then we sprinkle those hatchery-reared oysters on top of those reef bases or wild-grown blue mussels.
This is a drop in the ocean, quite literally. Even if 100 hectares of new reefs can be built here in the bay, it will still only restore 10% of what was originally here. Still, the project has enormous support nationally from community and government.
That's right, it is a really ambitious project. We've got 13 sites from Noosa all the way around to Perth, and we're trying to link these together to reform the forgotten southern reef, if you will, of these oyster reefs in all the bays and estuaries.
The sheer size of Port Phillip Bay makes this job easier. Elsewhere, modern demands on the marine environment make it much harder.
But if you go to other systems like sort of Gippsland Lakes or Noosa or Botany Bay, they're smaller, they're a lot busier, there's a lot more infrastructure, so it is harder to find places to restore shellfish reefs, but certainly achievable, and we're proving that throughout Australia as part of the National Reef Builder initiative.
If the program can achieve 60 new reefs, that would mean about a third of the original habitat will have been restored. That's a worthy, challenging, but immensely exciting goal.
But it's also putting back into nature, which is probably the most rewarding thing for us, and it makes us all feel good about coming to work and knowing that we're doing something right for the environment.
Coming up, the intensive care nurses who escaped to the country by buying an apple orchard.
Everyone literally thinks we were crazy for what we bought.
Yeah.
Because it was significant. We bought an acreage with 12,000 apple trees, and we didn't have any equipment. You know, we had a ute, and that was it. We'd never pruned an apple tree. You know, I'd never even owned an apple tree. You know, like, it's so different.
Earlier, we saw a story about the challenges facing the live export trade with Indonesia. Let's take a look at the export numbers from Darwin Port this year, because you'd need to go back into the history books to find a first quarter that was so slow. After a busy December, there's been 40,000 head exported in the first quarter, which is down 33% on the same period last year, and down 43% on the 5-year average. Something else worth noting here is that all of the cattle shipped so far have gone to the one destination, and that's Indonesia. There hasn't been a live export ship from Darwin to Vietnam since September. Supply has been a big problem in the north. It will improve over the next few months as mustering ramps up, but exporters are already concerned about where the cattle might come from in the second half of this year. And speaking of mustering, One of the biggest heli-mustering businesses in Australia has got brand new owners. You can read more about this if you head along to the ABC Rural website. Let's head to the sale yards where yardings were up, except in WA and South Australia. There was increased demand from feedlotters this week, and the medium cow indicator continues to fall. It's dropped more than 60 cents a kilo since hitting a record price last month. Lamb yardings were down in New South Wales by 40% and prices also fell. I've been told a lot of buying power is simply not there at the moment as abattoirs struggle with COVID and labour shortages. The boss of Gundagai Meat Processors told the Country Hour this week that it's got nearly 70 jobs vacant at its abattoir in the Riverina. It's tough in the west as well. Lamb slaughter numbers have crashed 43% in the last couple of weeks as COVID cases rise and abattoirs struggle. Australia's wool auctions were described as volatile this week, although in the end the benchmark indicator, the EMI, it fell by just 6 cents. The market is keeping a close eye on one of its competitors, with news emerging this week that China has banned wool imports from South Africa following an outbreak of foot and mouth disease. I spoke to Josh Lamb, who is the president of the Australian Council of Wool Exporters and Processors, and asked what ramifications this could have on the Australian market.
It hasn't affected Australia a lot. They'll put a little bit of pressure on the market here with Chinese mills switching orders to Australia, but what it means is obviously South Africa can't ship anything to China in the interim until they sort the issues out. South Africa went through a 7 or 8 month ban in 2019 where they did actually go through the process with Chinese government of setting up the right protocols if this happened again, which of course it has, but unfortunately it's China's actually knocked back those protocols as not being enough, so they're having to go through the process again. But reports out of South Africa probably won't be as long a ban as what they had in 2019, but it still could be a few months.
So are you expecting any lift in the price here in Australia?
Well, we did see a little bit of a lift Tuesday this week, principally off the back of what happened in South Africa. We gave a bit of that back in the market on Wednesday, but I don't think lifts will be significant, but there will be a tightening of the market for sure, particularly in that 19.5 to 21 micron range.
Overseas to Chicago now, where all commodities went up as dry conditions in the US play on the market's mind. While there's still plenty of time until harvest, the wheat-growing regions of the US are reportedly off to a really bad start and facing one of their worst droughts since 2012. In Australia, plenty of farmers are now sneaking onto paddocks to sow winter crops. I've been told trucking logistics have played a role in the climbing price for feed wheat. The sugar price is getting so close to that magical 20 cent a pound mark, although like all exports, the rising exchange rate is taking off a bit of shine. And that is the Landline Check on prices. Keep it rural.
The challenge of working in intensive care wards led 2 nurses to escape to the country. Despite zero farming experience, they bought an apple orchard in South Australia. And as Mount Gambier reporter Beck Wetham discovered, they're determined to make it work by doing things a little differently.
Fresh air, room to explore. There's a lot going for life in the country. Especially if you spend most of your time working in intensive care.
I was from Southern Adelaide, Chris was from Northeastern. We met, on night shift in the CBD, and I guess we both wanted some sort of hills lifestyle, maybe not, we never thought this intense, but yeah, we'd never ever come from anything like this.
You going to try one, Daze?
Yeah, sure.
You want that one? Yeah, it tastes.
Yum, 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 yum. Oh, sink your 2 teeth into that.
3 years after meeting in 2016, Emily and Chris Shipway made a bold change, buying this 9-hectare apple orchard in Lenswood in the Adelaide Hills.
So we looked around for about 2 years, and there isn't that much that is income producing at a level there where you can sort of have that life balance. So we looked at cherry orchards as well, vineyards, cattle, all that sort of stuff. But we ended up seeing apple orchards as something that's significantly diminishing the district, and it just happened by chance that we had an agent that found this for us. I think everyone literally thinks we were crazy for what we bought.
Yeah.
Because it was significant. We bought, you know, an acreage with 12,000 apple trees, and we didn't have any equipment. You know, we had a ute, and that was it. You know, we'd never pruned an apple tree. You know, I'd never even owned an apple tree. You know, like, it's so different.
Initially, they leased it back to the previous owners. This year is their first harvest running the show.
How's it going?
Yeah, so I'm just having a look through the thinning that we did.
It's all hands on deck. It has to be. On top of their new jobs as growers, Emily and Chris still work as nurses in Adelaide, commuting back and forth for night shifts. The decision to keep nursing was as personal as it was financial.
Yeah, at least some of the...
I decided when I was 11 that I wanted to be a nurse, so it was just something that until I had my first daughter, that's how I defined myself. You know, when I got my registration, it was like the proudest moment of my life, and that's all I ever wanted to do.
But it's not easy work.
There's a lot of sadness in a hospital. It's not a happy place. You know, nurses and doctors try and make it comfortable as best they can, but, you know, I got sick of seeing people die, and apples grow. Do you know what I mean? They have a life cycle that you can see them come through, and it's a beautiful thing to watch.
Even if it means they're constantly working.
Everything takes time. Nothing is a quick job. Something will break in the meantime, or just putting out the sprinklers. You know, we're not talking the little ones from Bunnings. Everything's this massive, you know, commercial scale for literally everything. Time
and money.
I didn't know that tractors cost so much money. I drove past farms and thought, oh yeah, it's a couple of $1,000. They're a couple of $100,000.
No doubt about it. This tree change has been a serious learning curve.
I don't think at all that we ever got the impression that we were wanted into the industry, and I don't mean that by the farmers that are up here. I just mean that it's not a promoted thing. Hey, get into farming. It's not when you're at high school you don't get told that you can, you know, be a doctor, nurse, a journalist, or you could be a farmer. Like, it's not an option. And, you know, speaking to other farmers, they get into it because it's been handed down to them. How do you actually get into farming?
They turn to other growers for help and advice on farming. They're relationships that have taken time.
Well, if we pick a couple, we should check their starch and see where we're at.
Yeah, I suppose it's when you're two people in your either, you know, late 20s, early 30s going up to these 60-year-olds and being like, hey, we bought an orchard in your hood. Can you help us out a little bit? Yeah, people don't think you're serious at all. And why would they? You know, because everybody who comes up here pushes out their trees and runs alpacas, or they might lease it out for a couple of years and then get rid of it. Whereas we were, no, we really want to do this, and it's probably taken us a couple of years and people actually watching us, you know, this, you know, blonde girl in a tractor, for them to actually go, oh, they were actually dead set serious.
Lenswood is the apple capital of South Australia, producing 85% of the state's output and nearly 10% nationally. The Shipway's entry into the industry has been welcomed by one grower in particular, consultant Susie Green.
So it's really rare for someone to come new into the industry because it is so challenging. It is challenging to grow apples and be efficient, particularly in this area where we have such steep terrain and small blocks. So even the growers who've been doing it for many generations have to be at the top of their game to do well. So for someone to come in with no knowledge, no machinery, no equipment is extremely challenging.
It's been a tough few years for anyone in the region.
The industry has really faced multiple successive hits in terms of hailstorms, bushfires, poor pricing due to oversupply nationally. The industry needs some critical mass to remain viable in terms of efficiencies, bringing workers to the region, having even just having agronomists in the region to support the industry. It's all those support services. If the industry becomes too small, they're just not going to be here, and then it becomes very difficult for those remaining orchards to survive.
part of Susie's job is encouraging growers to value add to their operations.
I think you really have to pick your markets and be clear about your markets that you're wanting to aim for and what's your...
She says many locals are watching how the shipways go with keen interest.
So one of the things that they provide is an alternate view, a different way of looking at things. So they're looking at the industry far more from a consumer perspective. So it's not, oh, we've been doing this way for generations. They're saying, well, as a consumer, I'm looking for this. I'm looking for this experience, for this tasting apple. So they bring that completely different viewpoint.
As well as growing fruit, the shipways are looking to diversify their orchards operations. They've got big plans for the site, including pick-your-own weekends during harvest and hosting events. They're even converting this old Nissan hut, once used as a bunker in World War II, into luxury accommodation. The shipways have taken inspiration from Damien McArdle, a fourth-generation pear grower in nearby Paracombe.
In 2012, my wife and I started our own brand, Paracombe Premium Perry. It was a diversification project to take fruit that wasn't any good for the fresh market, further process into juices and ciders. Nowadays we run a cellar door and everything on the property and have two completely separate businesses that actually really work well together. How's it going down here, Lauren?
Hailstorms in 2017 and 2018 prompted Damien to open a cellar door.
So that was really a driver of bringing an on-farm diversified business, I suppose. The thought was that if we could set it up so if we had a once in a 100-year hailstorm again, we could then diversify and have all of our income coming from something else, not fruit related. How are you guys? We've got the margarita for you and a chili chorizo.
Like apples, it's uncommon for local pear growers to expand beyond fruit growing.
There was a lot of people, not necessarily orchardists, but a lot of people that didn't understand what we were trying to do and I suppose just didn't believe it would work. We knew the value of our proximity to Adelaide, so we're just 10 minutes away from Teacher Gully in the Adelaide Hills. We knew that if we did the offering right, we could add value to wineries.
Back in Lenswood, Emily and Chris hope they'll be able to have the same success Damien has had. Days away from their first public open day, they're busy getting the place ready.
Want to hold that one, Charlie?
After months of hard work, the crop looks promising.
You ready? Have a mum. All right. Let's test some apples, eh?
The simple fact they're even growing apples still surprises Emily.
I literally walk up to an apple tree and I go, Chris, they look like apples. Like, how dumb's that? But you just go, wow, we actually, we grew these. You know, these are like commercial grade apples. Like, we're doing it just like everyone else is doing it.
And they intend to keep doing it for a long time.
Apple on a string, huh?
I'm not leaving unless I'm, pulled out of here in my coffin. I want a road named after us, even if I have to make that our driveway. I remember bringing Charlie home, our little baby, and being like, she's actually a Lenswardian. That's awesome. And I love that Daisy goes to school here with other kids that, their great-grandparents went to school here. I love that we're, a part of this. And, we're phonies.
Yeah.
We'll never be locals, ever. But hey,
our kids might be.
Our kids, yeah. And, we've done our bit for the place. We've, brought new blood in and, yeah, we're very proud of Lenswood.
Yeah.
It's great to see them giving it a go. That's the program for today. Next week, we'll be bringing you our Hard as Nails collection, showcasing some resilient characters from the bush. And you can find Landline stories on iView and at abc.net.au/rural. Here's the weekly weather outlook. I'll see you next week.
Hello from the Bureau with your weekly weather update for Sunday the 10th of April. Looking at the satellite, a high over the Tasman pushes cloud across the east coast. A cold front is approaching western Tasmania, while a deepening low south of WA is drawing cloud across the area. For the remainder of today, showers and isolated storms across parts of southern WA as the low impacts the southwest land division. Coastal showers in the east. Not much in rainfall totals, which is good news for recovery efforts. Storms possible further inland for New South Wales. Showers extending into eastern Victoria and Tasmania as well. For Monday, morning fogs along the east coast, followed by a finally mostly dry day. Wet weather for parts of the southeast. Isolated showers and storms for the tropical north, becoming cool and wet for southern WA, with the risk of heavier storm-driven falls in the far south. Tuesday, heavy falls possible for the Eucla and Esperance coasts, with rain and isolated storms reaching parts of the South Australian coast. Temperatures up to 10 degrees above average through inland South Australia and the interior, with settled and mostly clear conditions. Humid easterly winds increasing showers and storms across the top end, continuing for much of the week. On Wednesday, rain continuing for southeast WA, with showers and gusty winds pushing into southern South Australia as the complex low moves into the Bight. Showers also increase along the New South Wales coast. Showers moving eastwards across South Australia on Thursday, which is potentially good news for agricultural areas waiting to start cropping. Wetter weather also continues in the north and along the east coast. On Friday, a front bringing showers to Tassie and the far south of Victoria, and by the weekend, there's the potential for another low forming near southern WA. That's it for your weekly wrap. We'll see you again next week.
Inside the secret world of Israel's ultra-Orthodox. While men worship, wives are expected to serve.
We'll meet some of the men who feel they should never have to work.
אני מכוון להיות בן אדם שיודע ותשאל אותי בכל הלכה שלא יהיה בארון ואני אוכל לענות לך, זה החלום שלי.
But the pressure is mounting for them to adopt modern ways.
A culture war between Jews themselves.
Foreign Correspondent, Thursday at 8 on ABC and ABC iView.
Some shows are informative, but only one show gives you all the news you need and nothing you don't. You give us 30 minutes, we'll give you the week. Some assembly required.
The Weekly returns April 27.
The federal election campaign officially underway, with both leaders outlining their pitches to voters.
It's a choice between a strong future and an uncertain one.
We are a great country, but we can be even better.
Evidence that Russian forces used civilians as human shields in Ukraine. And Max Verstappen's Australian Grand Prix comes to an abrupt end, paving the way for Ferrari.
Magic in Melbourne. Charles Leclerc wins the Australian Grand Prix for Ferrari.
Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm David Chow. The speculation is over. Australians will head to the polls on Saturday, May the 21st. The Prime Minister announced the election date after visiting the Governor-General in Canberra this morning, meaning we're set for 6 weeks of campaigning. Scott Morrison's pitch is his government is not perfect, but one to stick with in uncertain times. For Anthony Albanese, it's that Australians deserve better, and he's ready to lead.
For the second time in his prime ministership, the underdog swept through the gates and around the grounds of Government House, seeking vice-regal consent to call an election. He got it, sending 17 million Australians to the polls.
This election is about you, no one else. It's about our country and it's about its future.
With his character under attack and popularity in decline, Scott Morrison's trying not to make this election about him, but rather his government's record.
It's a choice between a strong future and an uncertain one. It's a choice between a government you know and a Labor opposition that you don't.
Here you go, close up.
A 26-year veteran of federal parliament, the Labor leader's still defining himself to voters.
I am who I am. I'm a working class lad. I'm comfortable in a boardroom and I'm comfortable in a pub.
Anthony Albanese's ditched the big taxing, big spending agenda that Labor took to the last election, adopting a smaller target strategy focused on hot-button issues like childcare and aged care.
I'm ready, we are ready, and Australia is ready for a better future.
But it's personality, not policies, that will likely define this campaign. Scott Morrison handing his opponents more ammunition.
Will Alan Tudge be in your cabinet if your government is returned then?
Alan Tudge is still in my cabinet.
Fact check, he's not. He quit cabinet in March.
It just shows the chaos that's there, even when people step aside.
Scott Morrison's chosen the latest possible date to hold this election, an indication he thinks he can grind his opponent down in coast-to-coast campaigning over 6 weeks. But time and incumbency appear to be more fickle factors now than they were during the pandemic, especially when Labor's out to present this current government as an almost decade-old coalition enterprise, not just the 3.5 years Mr Morrison's presided over.
Our government is not perfect. We've never claimed to be. But we are up front.
Acknowledging the government's flaws, the Prime Minister's appealing to voters to stick with what they know.
There is so much at stake for Australia and our future.
While the Labor leader says there's no time like now to change.
This is our time to seize the opportunities that are before us.
On May 21.
With the date set, the campaign's officially kicked off.
In the words of the great Ramones, hey ho, let's go.
And judgment from voters awaits.
Thank you very much.
Jane Norman, ABC News, Canberra.
Now let's take a look at some of the key seats. Here's ABC data analyst Casey Briggs.
If you want to know where Mr Morrison and Mr Albanese are going to spend a lot of their time in the next 6 weeks, well, perhaps the best thing we can do is look back at this Clayton's campaign we've had, if you like, in the last few months about where the unofficial campaign has been fought. And the 3 states that we're seeing time and time again people visiting, leaders visiting, are New South Wales, Queensland and WA. New South Wales, Sydney is where Mr Albanese started, or has spent today, first this afternoon launching his bid for re-election at the Commonwealth offices in Sydney, but he actually started the day in the seat of Reid, a government-held seat on a margin of 3.2% that, you know, they would be hoping to pick up if they are to form government at come May 21. But the Prime Minister, all of these pins are locations that either Mr Morrison or Mr Albanese have been in the past week. So you can see there are a lot of pins on the board. They've been a lot of places. The Prime Minister heading to Shortland, heading to Dobell, heading to Robertson, all up the New South Wales Central Coast, but also seats in Sydney like the seat of Banks, as well as the seat of Parramatta and even the seat of McMahon. So lots to play for in New South Wales and Sydney in particular. We've seen Mr Albanese spending a lot of time in Brisbane and the southeast of Queensland, seats like Lilly, which is a marginal Labor-held seat, but they'd also be hoping to pick up seats like Dixon, held by the Defence Minister Peter Dutton, the seat of Longman, held by Terry Young on a margin of 3.3%. Queensland as a whole is actually a state that swung to the government last election. That's what helped Scott Morrison win that miracle victory that he called it, at least. Regional Queensland seats like Flynn would be ones that the Labor Party would be hoping to make some inroads in, which swung toward the coalition last time. And that third state that I mentioned is WA, where, again, Anthony Albanese has spent some time this week visiting a couple of seats. One is Hasluck on a margin of 5.4% held by the government. The other is the seat of Swan, stopping a couple of times there during the week as well. So they are probably some of the places that, you know, if you live there and you're excited about politics, great, you might be seeing a lot of election campaigning in the weeks to come. If you're not so excited, I'm sorry, you'll just have to brace for it because the campaign is coming your way.
Ukrainian authorities say they're preparing for another Russian offensive. It follows the release of satellite images showing a Russian military convoy moving through eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian ambassador to the United Kingdom is warning the worst may be yet to come.
We expect that the forces which have been thrown away from Kyiv will regroup and resupplied and will go somewhere east and south of Ukraine. The most dangerous parts is the Odessa port of Odessa, which is our southern ports, so many of them in Black Sea, and they are totally blocked right now. This teeny city of Mariupol in the Sea of Azov, and all east of Ukraine. That's where we will see probably the next battles, and I'm afraid, very bloody ones.
And Ukrainian officials say they've uncovered more evidence of brutal Russian aggression. It follows reports from the village of Yahudne, where civilians say they were held captive and used as human shields. The Prosecutor General of Ukraine says her country has identified thousands of cases of alleged war crimes.
We started 5,600 cases in Ukraine only about war crimes. We have our anchor case from these 5,600 cases, 02 cases, sorry. And we have our main anchor case where we have 500 suspects. It's a case about aggression crime, aggression Russian Federation against Ukraine.
French voters are casting their ballots in the opening round of a presidential race, which could become a cliffhanger. Emmanuel Macron has a fight on his hands from far-right challenger Marine Le Pen, who's been galvanised by a slick election campaign. 49 million people are eligible to decide which 2 of 12 candidates should take part in the runoff vote. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has been ousted from office after losing a vote of no confidence in Parliament. Opposition supporters danced in celebration on the streets of Islamabad after the late-night vote. The former cricket great has been accused of poor economic management and for clamping down on dissent during his term as leader. Imran Khan was elected Prime Minister in 2018, promising to fight corruption and to improve the economy. The 69-year-old has claimed there's a US-led conspiracy against him, and his supporters say they'll fight to have him reinstated. An interim Prime Minister will be appointed to serve until the elections are held late next year. And there's little sign of China changing its strict zero-tolerance approach to COVID-19, ordering all 19 million people in the southern city of Guangzhou into mandatory testing, following just 2 cases. Further north in Shanghai, videos showing civilians fed up with the strict pandemic measures are circulating on Chinese social media. Another shows a drone urging residents to comply with COVID restrictions and to control their soul's desire for freedom. Shanghai's 25 million residents remain under a strict citywide lockdown that began last week. There are widespread reports of limited access to food and medicine. Harsh restrictions have failed to contain the outbreak, with the city reporting more than 23,000 new infections in the latest round of testing. The Sydney Roosters have won their first NRLW premiership, defeating the Dragons 16-4. It was third time lucky for the Roosters after losing 2 grand finals in recent seasons.
An all New South Wales decider hosted in Queensland. Still, 7,855 fans were eager to witness the first NRLW grand final to be played in the Sunshine State. And the crowd didn't have to wait long for the first try of the afternoon.
And the Dragons, inside 90 seconds, open the scoring on grand final day.
Shortly after, the Dragons would lose playmaker Talia Fuimeono to the bin after a high shot on Bridie Parker, who suffered a serious knee injury. The Roosters tried time after time to score, but couldn't break the Dragons' defence.
Again, they come up with amazing defence.
But the points would finally come in the second half.
The Roosters tie it up in the grand final.
The Roosters would add another 10 minutes later.
Look out, here goes Isabel Kelly!
But it was the match winner with just minutes to go, which was clouded by controversy.
Player down, and they must stop play. Oh no, Higgins! But this doesn't look right. That is a Roosters trainer saying, let's stop play. Next minute, the Roosters score a try.
And the last try,
I'm not really sure, if that's an obstruction or not, but at the end of the day, the Roosters were a better team.
The girls were just outstanding, so proud of them.
Jessica Stewart, ABC News, Redcliffe.
Ferrari's Charles Leclerc has won this year's Australian Formula One Grand Prix in emphatic fashion in the race's return to Melbourne. It was a tough day for reigning world champion Max Verstappen, who was forced to retire mid-race.
After the longest wait, Ferrari is once again back on top in Australia.
This one means a lot, clearly.
There was a sense of anticipation as Formula One returned to Melbourne, waiting for a race 3 years in the making.
We welcome the world back to Australia. The Australian Grand Prix is go. We're racing in Melbourne.
It didn't take long for the revised track to claim its first victim as Carlos Sainz's horror weekend continued. A strong start from Lewis Hamilton pushed him up the order as the 7-time world champion battled with Red Bull's Sergio Perez.
What a move.
A back and forth that was cut short due to a safety car after 2-time winner in Australia Sebastian Vettel crashed out.
Aston Martin just to complete their shocking weekend.
Ferrari's newfound pace this season continued to pay dividends as Charles Leclerc held off a challenge from the world champion Max Verstappen.
Leclerc still has it, just
before his Red Bull machinery fouled him.
That's now some weird fluid. Yeah. Right, everything is itself.
Mercedes pair of Hamilton and George Russell started to find their form in a battle with Red Bull's Sergio Perez, but there was no stopping Leclerc, the 24-year-old claiming his first win in Australia and the second for the season.
The man from Monaco, magic in Melbourne, Charles Leclerc wins the Australian Grand Prix for Ferrari.
McLaren teammates Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris largely battled it out with each other, Norris finishing 5th and the Australian cheered home in 6th. After a 2-year absence, fans certainly have turned out in force. A record number of F1 fans have made their way to Albert Park, with more than 400,000 making their way through the gates over the 4 days. And with a crowd of 128,000 today, the Grand Prix is back on the podium of major events. Fraser Fife, ABC News, Melbourne.
Now let's check the weather in the capitals for Monday. Sunny in Brisbane, a late shower in Sydney and Canberra, a clearing shower in Melbourne, cloudy in Hobart and Adelaide, a clearing shower in Perth, and sunny in Darwin, a top of 35 degrees. And that's the latest from ABC News. Remember, you can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm David Chow. Thanks for watching.
Mysterious, suspenseful, thrilling. New drama on ABC iView.
Who are you?
I'm a bad person who's trying to be good.
What you did dishonors all cops.
When a man is prey to his emotions, he is not his own master.
There's been a report of inappropriate behavior.
This life, this is all we need. You don't need to prove yourself to anyone.
To stream the best drama for free, log in to ABC iView.
Are you ready for the Gardening Australia Easter special?
Maggie Beer is cooking up a new project.
It's about no longer allowing institutionalised food. And there's so much we have to do because there's so many people without support.
Enter a breathtaking world of colour.
I just think that looks magnificent.
And why not try edible flowers with your eggs this Easter?
These little beauties also have a little sweet treat hiding for you.
Gardening Australia, Friday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
The Clayton's campaign is finally about to end and the starter's gun will be fired. Shortly, the Prime Minister will fly to Canberra and call the election. But after another disastrous week, he starts from behind. I'm Patricia Carvelis, standing in for David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. It's been a horror week for Scott Morrison, with unprecedented levels of bloodletting, allegations of bullying, lying and politicising flood funding. Then Michael Toke, the man who has accused Scott Morrison of racial vilification in the Liberal Party ballot more than a decade ago, claimed a federal cabinet minister had texted him to say, "I believe you," in response to his allegations. The only glimmer of hope for the Prime Minister was the High Court's decision to not intervene in an ugly factional battle in New South Wales that threatened the party's chances in a number of crucial seats. Labor leader Anthony Albanese, meanwhile, is positioned where he told his team he'd be as the fourth quarter begins, kicking with the wind and ahead in the polls. But momentum in politics, like sport, can shift under your feet. And the government is hoping that the Prime Minister's visit to the Governor-General sparks a second miracle.
Here we go. Everyone get in.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog.
You guys better fill up.
Welcome to the campaign before the campaign.
On opposite sides of the country, the leaders campaigned in enemy territory.
This is Mr Albanese, mate.
Yeah, I'm running for Prime Minister.
You look much nicer in reality than what
Oh, actually good. Did you get that?
This looks cool. Yeah. Want to have a go? Sure. Oh.
Wow.
I've got a tough question. Are you up for it?
I'm absolutely up for it. We're just taking questions from journalists because that's what you do at a press conference.
Good luck. They win the election.
Thank you very, very much.
Got to win.
We're working hard at it. So.
I'll be praying for you to get in, I tell you.
Thank you.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog.
Can I have a go? I quite like my day job. Head to keep it.
But Scott Morrison's real issue is the almost daily attack on his character.
A disgruntled Liberal will tomorrow ask the High Court to hear a challenge to controversial captain's pick pre-selections.
Well, it's an absolute debacle.
It's civil war in the New South Wales branch of the Liberal Party.
I stood up for the women in my team.
The Prime Minister's intervention has stepped above the factional fray.
It is not true what is being said about the Prime Minister. He's a strong leader, but he's also a good man.
Are you calling the election tomorrow?
No.
Where are you doing it on the weekend then?
The election will be called soon enough, and it's going to be a very important election. Cheers. Thanks, mate. No worries.
How does it feel to be served by the Prime Minister?
Nothing greater, hey?
In a Newcastle pub last night, the Prime Minister was abused by a disability pensioner.
This is what you said when you got elected last time. Those that have a go will get a go.
Correct.
Well, I've had a go, mate.
The Prime Minister listening politely, at one point looking exasperated.
You better do something.
The quiet Australians aren't quiet anymore. Australians are standing up and giving the Prime Minister a gobful.
I was keen to understand what he was saying to me, and I believe we have. It is a complicated case.
Soon it will be time for the Prime Minister to down tools and visit the Governor-General.
The High Court this afternoon threw out a bid to challenge a dozen Liberal pre-selections in New South Wales.
Will you be calling the election tomorrow?
We're going to do this every day. You'll know very soon.
How soon?
Very soon.
How soon? Monday?
You'll know when I'm announcing it.
Call the election, let the Australian people decide.
You know I feel all right.
See ya.
See ya, thank you.
My guest this morning is Deputy Labor leader Richard Marles. But first, let's see what's making news this morning. A short time ago, the Prime Minister boarded a plane at Sydney Airport. He's headed to Canberra to visit the Governor-General, David Hurley, to fire the starting gun for an election no later than May 21. Meanwhile, in the Sunday Age, James Massola reports that Liberal Party Federal Vice President Tina McQueen has delivered a withering assessment of the party's chances in two must-hold seats, suggesting sitting MPs Trent Zimmerman and Katie Allen could lose, but says, and I quote, "With a couple of lefties gone, we can get back to our core philosophy." And a story in the News Corp papers reveals an associate of the Chinese billionaire named in Parliament as a suspected puppeteer working for a foreign power to interfere in the federal election was until recently active in Labor's campaign for the marginal seat of Reid, a seat being targeted by Labor. Well, It's hard to remember a worse week for a Prime Minister this close to an election. Day after day, a conga line of people, some from his own side, fronted up to demolish his character. It fuelled the Labor narrative that the Prime Minister has issues with trust and disrupted the government's efforts to reset the agenda and focus on its perceived strengths. Now, the Prime Minister starts this election campaign from way behind, with every national poll showing he has lost support with voters. But after winning the unwinnable election in 2019, there is trepidation even within Labor. The Prime Minister dismissed the growing list of critics from his own side of politics as having an axe to grind and defended a series of captain's picks for New South Wales Liberal Party pre-selection, arguing he was standing up for women in his party. But he starts the campaign from a position of weakness. Let's see what the panel makes of it. And joining me this morning is Fran Kelly, Gareth Parker and Jennifer Hewitt. Lovely to be joined by all of you on this very significant day. And I think we've got pictures on the screen right now just to sort of demonstrate how much this is unfolding. The Prime Minister's plane taxiing in Sydney. He will any moment now fly to Canberra and call the election officially. Jennifer,
thank heavens.
And Fran Kelly is about to have a party on the couch. Let's start the party room. Jennifer, what will the opening gambit be? What will the opening statement be from both of these leaders?
Well, the government will be campaigning very strongly on its record and saying, look, we've kept the economy strong and we've kept you safe. But more importantly, it will also be saying you can't risk all of this in these uncertain times with Labor. You know, they'll come after you. They won't manage the economy well. This is really the bad time to change courses. And, of course, you're going to hear a lot more about, oh, you know, the Labor Party is just a blank piece of paper and you don't know them, you know us. So I think that's going to be the government's very firm view, and then you're going to have from Labor kind of continuing digs at the Prime Minister's character, and of course they've had enormous help from the Liberal Party themselves, all for a long time now, but particularly in the last week, and they're going to be saying we care more basically, and we can help you in your households, we can make you feel better about things like childcare. They're even promising to, you know, reduce energy prices, which is, you know, quite a brave call, really, in this environment for anyone. But but it will be still very much based on the character of the Prime Minister and the fact that Labor can make households have a much better and better future than they would under a government that's out of touch.
Yeah, Fran, we did get a taste of what they will say really in their opening pitches today, which will be significant moments at the start of the campaign in their election ads that they released last night, giving us the strongest indication today was the day.
Exactly.
And also the Prime Minister's committed clearly, we understand, to a long campaign. May 21st is likely to be the day.
It looks like May 21st will be the day, and the thinking there will be the Prime Minister and the coalition clearly believe they've got a campaign advantage, a campaigning advantage on Anthony Albanese. He's untested. They think they've seen already his vulnerabilities. The longer the Prime Minister gets to go, he proved last time he's a strong campaigner, better for him. Also, Easter's in the middle of it, don't forget, so they lose a few days there, really. He needs that time, probably. But as Jennifer said, the ads that came out last night, the themes in the ads from the Prime Minister, basically, these are tough times, I've managed it, don't risk the other side. Anthony Albanese's ad also belies the fact that Labor knows what the vulnerabilities are, and it is Anthony Albanese and this notion of can you risk the economy with him. His ad tells us he did an economics degree at Sydney Uni, for instance, and reminds us he was infrastructure minister for several years. The fact that they feel they need to remind the electorate, I think, is just borne out reflects what the polls show, which is although the polls clearly show that the voters have certainly Scott Morrison's lost his shine with the voters, that they're not convinced that Anthony Albanese is the guy yet.
We will get to the polls a little later in the program with a special news segment we're going to unveil. But Gareth, obviously we've got the coalition saying these are uncertain times. Yep. Don't risk it. You know, better the devil you know appears to be the campaign strategy.
The coalition are desperate to get this into campaign mode and to actually make the issue a comparison, almost like a shopping list. And they've been running ads in Western Australia in newspapers, running them down line by line. When Labor was last in office, now our record now, unemployment, number of boats arrived, defence spending per GDP, all of these things, they're inviting the comparison. If you think about John Howard, he would never refer to an opposition leader by name, it would always be my opponent. How often have we heard the Prime Minister this week talk about Anthony Albanese.
Every
they
single
actually
day.
want to draw the comparison. So it's quite unusual in that respect. The conventional wisdom is you don't want to elevate the opposition leader to the same level as you.
They want to put in front and centre. And that notion of, too, is, you know, it's all about risk. But is it a risk saying stick with what you know when the polls are signifying that what people know from this Prime Minister and this government, they're not actually liking too much?
But that's why he's saying it's very important. This is not a referendum on the government because he knows he'd lose that. It's a choice between, basically, between Scott Morrison and Albanese.
So I think... don't mean to be rude, but let's get into the horror week for the Prime Minister. I have not seen such a horror week for a Prime Minister this close to an election. And really, it was kicked off by a couple of really key moments. I think Michael Toke, who is the man who was defeated by the Prime Minister 2007 for the pre-selection for the Prime Minister's seat, he had, and the panel was discussing it last week, talked about racial vilification being used. Then he spoke to the project this week and went further. Here he is.
I've got text messages from a cabinet minister telling me, I believe you, and do what you need to do, just be careful.
So, Fran Kelly, Michael Toke obviously is not going away.
No, and if, you know, this is a sideshow. Most people don't know who Mike Toke is. They don't really care about a pre-selection issue. Racial vilifications, a lot of voters do care about that, but also that notion that there's a cabinet minister who's texted him recently saying, I believe you. That came on the day after we saw the reprint of the alleged text messages between former New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian and an unnamed cabinet minister. Is it the same cabinet minister? That was an old story, but actually seeing the text in the paper, you could see, oh, I see, it does look like it really was Gladys Berejiklian saying he's a horrible, horrible person, and supposedly a cabinet minister saying he's a complete psycho. So this notion that there's rats in the ranks, I think, must be unsettling, you'd think, for the Prime Minister, but also just goes to his own side. Those closest to him, his own cabinet table, are working against him.
And New South Wales Liberal Catherine Cusack also fired a bit of a shot at the Prime Minister, and I thought that was quite significant too. She's obviously in the state parliament. She's a Liberal. She's on the progressive side. She's not in the Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells side, but she used the same language. She said he was a self-serving bully. That was quite significant too this week. More criticism of his character, Jennifer.
Well, that's right. I mean, I don't think you've ever had a Prime Minister who's been so attacked remorselessly from his own side, and I think that is very damaging. The question is whether it obviously confirms people's views. How much it changes people's views is another matter, however, and that's why I think that's kind of very important for the government to try and get rid of this false, you know, the fake campaign so far and move into the campaign proper. But I don't think there's any way that you can excuse the New South Wales Liberals in general from having created such a disaster, and Scott Morrison does bear a lot of the responsibility for that. They will now, of course, all be trying to be slightly more disciplined, but I just think you talk about starting from behind, but then shooting yourself in the foot. That they're doing a very good job. So the Liberals will have to have a very good campaign to make up for this.
Well, Gareth, that's the thing now. It's all about the campaign now for them to claw back support. What's the precedent for that? Can they do it?
Well, it's the mathematics about those 8 seats. And so I think this actually becomes not a national campaign. I don't think we see a uniform swing. I think we see almost state-by-state based campaigns, and even within states, the messages that are run in inner Sydney will be different to the messages run in Newcastle or on the coast. In Western Australia, it'll be very much about the 2 to 3 marginal seats, and we'll talk about those later. But I think the campaign messages will be tailored. There'll be a Victorian campaign, a New South Wales campaign, a Queensland campaign, a West Australian campaign.
Yeah. That's right. And, you know, to use the footy analogy Anthony Albanese liked to use some time ago, coming in the fourth quarter with the wind behind you, that's all very well. But, you know, I watched the Swans yesterday, and they came from behind in that last quarter, and they won on the knell. And that's, you know, that's what Scott Morrison, he can see that path to another miracle win.
Now, the Prime Minister's plane has now left Sydney. It's on its way to Canberra. He will land. And then, of course, he will make that very important drive to Government House. That's all happening right now. It's happening. It's on. I love a campaign, so I've got to say I love democracy. Let's just talk about the troubles in New South Wales, because they're big for the Prime Minister, and that pressure he's under internally and why this has gone on so long was clearly asked of him when Lee Sales interviewed him on 7:30. He had an interesting response. Here he is.
I'm asked all the time, Lee, why wasn't the Prime Minister do more about getting good women in Parliament and stand up for the women in Parliament? See, I stood up for the women in my team.
Was he standing up for the women?
Well, as Lee was just saying, it wasn't just the women. Of course, 50% of the candidates that he was backing, the captain's picks, were male, and the 3 sitting members that he protected were Susan Lee, she's a woman, and as she said, she was very grateful for that protection, but also Alex Hawke, who's the Prime Minister's sort of factional lieutenant, and Trent Zimmerman, who's in trouble in his seat of North Sydney, according to Tina McQueen anyway. Thanks, Tina. So, no, it wasn't just the women, and if that was his message, then why hadn't he announced that earlier? Because that would have been a really strong positive message. Instead, this whole thing has made, to quote Perrottet, a debacle. The New South Wales was the state that 2 months ago the Libs were telling you was their path to victory. They're still saying that today, but you'd have to think that, you know, it's all is not happy in that powerhouse state of New South Wales, the Prime Minister's own state, which, you know, goes to issues around his authority. But also, are the troops going to be out on election day campaigning and handing out how to vote cards and all of that? There is real trouble in paradise.
And Jennifer, this all happened very late on Friday, but in the High Court, the Prime Minister basically, he was cleared. His choices have been held up. He can go to the election. It kind of cleared that little roadblock he was facing just in the nick of time. But really, why so late?
Well, of course, it wasn't all his choices anyway. I mean, that's what's so ridiculous about this whole thing. It was very much a factional battle where the centre-right faction to which Hawke belongs and the Prime Minister had their own candidates they wanted to put in. And it comes back to this thing of if you can't govern yourself, how can you govern the country? I think that is a very, very kind of damaging thing. But to Gareth's point about it being a seat-by-seat election, it's meant that instead of having candidates out there for months being able to campaign, get themselves known, talk about, you know, why they should be elected, they're starting, you know, right now. And of course people do pay more attention once the election's called, but really they have handicapped themselves spectacularly and there is no excuse for it.
And the recriminations will be deep.
Yes.
And they've already started, it appears. So let's see. All right, up next, the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party, Richard Marles. But first, here's Prime Minister Scott Morrison discussing what he thinks the election will be about.
There'll be plenty of opportunity for scrutiny, and I encourage people to look carefully at these things. You know, elections are serious things, as the Australian people know. They know it's not a reality show, it's not based on who they like or don't like. They know it's about the economy they will live in as a result of the decisions that are taken by their government.
Richard Marles, welcome to Insiders.
Thanks, Patricia.
What's this election about?
Well, I think this election comes at a really significant moment in Australian history, and I think the election is a huge opportunity for the country. The pandemic, I think, has really given Australia the biggest opportunity to reimagine the nation since the end of the Second World War. And we stand on the cusp of an opportunity to strengthen Medicare, an opportunity to fix aged care, an opportunity to give rise to affordable childcare. We have the opportunity to build an economy which actually sees us making things in Australia again, actually turning science into jobs and generating the kind of secure, well-paid employment which will see wages going again. Now, you know, Labor believes in all of that opportunity and wants to see it taken. It's also, I might say, an opportunity to restore integrity and honesty to the position of the Prime Ministership. But the real risk here is that if Scott Morrison is re-elected, all of those opportunities go begging.
OK, Labor is ahead in the national polls, and in fact that trend has been established for some time. The Prime Minister has been under unprecedented pressure this week. This is your election to lose, isn't it?
Oh, look, I think it's going to be a close eleation.
But why, if that trend is there and the Prime Minister is being character assassinated by his own side? It's yours to lose.
Well, in terms of the polls, I mean, I feel like we live in a post-poll world, and anyone who went through certainly any Labor person who went through the 2019 election, aside from probably experiencing some PTSD from that, we completely know that, the polls can get it wrong, and I think this is going to be a real struggle. Look, you are right in terms of what's happening inside the Liberal Party. I mean, the Liberal Party right now is a bin fire, and if you can't govern your own party, then what chance do you have of governing the country? But the reason it's a bin fire and the reason that the Liberals are in the position at the moment is because the Prime Minister lies. I mean, every time he stands up, he lies. He lied last week about Labor not listing drugs on the PBS when we were last in power. That's just a lie. And he's been called out as a liar by world leaders. He's been called out as a liar by members of his own team. The record shows he's a liar, and the Australian people know he's a liar.
Okay.
And for all of that, it is so corrosive on the national interest to have somebody like that in the Prime Ministership.
Labor hasn't opposed anything in the budget. You've supported the coalition in the cost of living handouts, the tax cuts, industrial relations, defence spending, national security, I can go on. Your actions demonstrate that the government must be getting it right on the main issues because you keep backing them.
No, I don't accept that. I mean, and I'd make this point, people are making the allegation about small targets. Just because an idea is not divisive doesn't make it small. We've made our position in relation to childcare and in fixing aged care. These are real differences from the government. And I tell you, when I speak to constituents in my electorate, all of they see those ideas as being big ideas. Fixing aged care really matters in this country. Now, the Prime Minister seeks to go out and divide and create difference in our country. That's not what Albo's about. Anthony is actually about bringing the country together, bringing people together, and putting on the table the kind of big ideas which do that, and which are going to make a difference in people's lives.
Anthony Albanese has promised registered nurses 24/7 in aged care facilities. I think it's by mid next year.
Yes.
Mark Dreyfus this week said it wasn't necessarily possible to deliver that. Who's right?
We'll be delivering registered nurses in every aged care facility in the middle of next year.
Then why did Mark Dreyfus suggest it might not happen?
Well, we've been really clear about the fact that that is what will happen.
Well, it wasn't clear. Well, so why wasn't it clear? Is it just because it's just too difficult to do?
No, that's not right. And Anthony's made it clear, Mark Butler and Claire O'Neill have made it clear. I'm making it clear now. We will do this in the middle of next year. We're doing it a year ahead of the recommendation, or the timing and the recommendation of the Royal Commission. And we're doing that because...
No pausing if
pausing,
it's too hard?
Because getting registered nurses, it's obviously really important to have them in aged care settings, in terms of the services and what they can provide. But it's also the leadership that they provide within aged care facilities. And we really need that leadership as soon as possible, which is why we see it as fundamentally
And what
important.
are you prepared to do to get the right workforce here? Because there are workforce shortage issues.
Yeah, that's true. And so there's a couple of points there. I mean, at the heart of it, I think, is the question of wages for registered nurses and those working in aged care. We need to make sure that we do get a wage increase there, both in terms of maintaining retention within aged care, but also attracting people. And I think there is an opportunity to get people back into aged care, working in aged care, and to keep those already there if we're paying people properly.
Richard Marles, will Labor commit to what could be $4 billion a year for aged care wages?
Well, we've made it clear that we will support the outcome of the wage case.
If it could be up to $4 billion a year.
Yeah, and there is a process which gives rise to that. And might I say, the government have also made clear that they will be absorbing those costs as well. The difference here is we're going to use the government's voice, if we were to get elected, to argue for that wage increase, and for precisely the reasons that I've just said. I mean, this is a sector which is really underpaid. And so, it is the right thing to do as a matter of justice. But in terms of making sure that we get the workforce, attract them and keep them, you've got to pay people properly. So we see that as really central to our whole message around fixing aged care.
Given it's a big price tag, why not a levy? How else are you going to pay for it?
Well, we've made clear what the costs of our package are, and as we will all the policies that we take to this election, and we'll have all our costings out there before election day as we normally would.
Will Labor boost funding for public schools?
We've made it clear that we need to see the full funding going to public schools when the states renegotiate this in 2023. And that's the principal commitment that we've made there.
So what does that mean?
Well, what it means is that at the moment we've seen private schools, almost all of them are near their full funding commitment, whereas most public schools are not. That is the inequity which needs to be fixed, and the commitment that we've made is that we will put public schools on a pathway to their full funding in the negotiations that occur in the next round in 2023.
You promised at the last election to boost public school funding by $14 billion over a decade. Do public schools still need that money?
Well, as I say, the point we've made is that at the next negotiation, which is in 2023 with the states in relation to that, our commitment is to put that school funding on a pathway to the funding that they would expect.
Sorry, so next year is that negotiation you're saying. When will we get the price tag of how much extra you'll commit to those public schools?
Well, again, we have put all our policies out there, and we will, and the funding for them.
In this election, will we get some clarity on how much extra you'll spend?
Of course.
And will it be significant? Do you think there's a case for significant increases?
We will make all of that clear, but the critical commitment we have made in relation to government schools is that we will put them on a path to getting that full funding in the negotiations that occur in 2023.
OK, and that could cost billions?
Well, as I said, Patricia, we will put all our costings out there before the election.
Will Labor boost hospital funding, as you promised before the last election?
Well, again, we will be putting those costings out before the election. I mean, all of this is costings that we will put out before the election so that people have a really clear choice.
Look, we're about to enter the election campaign, and I know you'll make announcements later. That's logical.
Yeah, that's right.
But I'm talking about the spirit here. You are prepared to spend significantly more than the Morrison government on things like, as I ask, hospitals?
Well, you'll hear, as I say, you'll hear more to say.
But I want to nail it down whether you will commit more. Is that what you're saying here?
You'll hear more from us in relation to health during the course of the campaign, and I'll leave our announcements to those moments.
Should we expect a bigger spend from Labor on health in this federal election campaign?
Let me say this. Labor has always been the party which is focused on health. And if health is the issue that people are focused on in terms of going to election, then there will be a very clear choice at this election as to who you should be voting for.
How about people living on the New Start allowance? We know cost of living pressures are intense. There are some short-term measures the government has introduced, but people on the New Start allowance are suffering significantly. Will you increase the payment?
Well, again, we have made it clear that we've thought there should be an increase in New Start, and there has been some.
Not to the extent you wanted.
Well, there has been increases, and that's come by virtue of the pressure and the campaigning that we've done in relation to New Start. We obviously want to see that in a better place, but we've made our commitments, and all of that will be clear coming into the election.
Labor says no new taxes or tax increases, apart from multinationals, right? But you won't commit to this self-imposed cap on taxes that the government has. Does that mean you're prepared to let bracket creep do the work for you?
No, we've made it really clear, as you said, other than making sure that multinationals are paying their fair share of tax in this country, we've made it really clear we're not going to be raising taxes. And we couldn't have been more clear on that. Now, during this election, again, you're going to hear a whole lot of lies from the government about this.
Why not commit to the cap then?
Well, we've made it really clear we are not going to raise taxes other than
OK, but why not commit to the cap
getting multinationals paying their fair share? Well, our commitments are clear here. But can I just say, we will hear a whole lot of scare campaigning on the part of the government.
But haven't you just made it easier if you won't commit to the cap?
We couldnn be making it clearer that we are not going to raise taxes.
Then why not commit to the cap?
Well, because we're making the commitment that which I've just articulated.
Do you concede, though, that you open yourself, you make yourself vulnerable by not committing to that cap?
I think if we're making it clear that we're not going to raise taxes, that's what the Australian people want to hear. And I don't think
why not commit to it then if you're not going to increase taxes anyway?
Well, I don't think I can say more than what I've just said. We are not going to be raising taxes. It is as simple as that. And the scare campaign that you will hear from the government about this comes from the government, which is the second highest taxing government in our country's history, the highest being the Howard government. So if you want to look at form here, this is a high-taxing, big-spending government that we've got with Scott Morrison. We are not going to raise taxes, pure and simple.
You're the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party. I know a bit about Labor Party rules. It means you can choose your job if you win the election. Do you want to be Treasurer?
I'm really focused on reconstruction, and I can tell you that if the election is the 21st of May, then my head is in the space of between now and that date.
No,
going to be getting ahead of that at all.
Do you think Jim Chalmers should stay as Treasurer?
I think Jim Chalmers has done a fantastic job as our Treasury spokesperson. I think all of those are questions for Anthony, but I think Jim has done...
You get to choose. That's what the rule says. So you can say to Anthony Albanese, actually really want to be Treasurer. Are you going to do it?
Well, let me say, in relation to me, I am focused on reconstruction. When Albo and I talked about establishing this portfolio just over a year ago, it really was imagining then, as it's turned out to be the case, that this election would be held in an environment where the country was coming out of the pandemic, and we really needed to be thinking about what kind of an economy we wanted to build and making sure that it was an economy which generated secure, well-paid jobs.
So you don't want to be Treasurer? You won't be asking Anthony Albanese to be Treasurer?
I'm not. I won't be. But what I am
you
focused.
Won't be asking.
But what I'm focused on here is between now and the 21st of May, doing the job of reconstruction, and I'm not going to get ahead of myself and start measuring curtains about what might happen after that date. There's an election to be won here. And we kind of, we're not going to make the mistake of 3 years ago. This is a close election. It's there to be won, and it can be lost. And so our focus is on making sure that each and every day between now and then, we are about trying to win that election.
Absolutely, you do have to win first, no doubt. But you are the Deputy Leader, so you do get to choose. You said you won't be asking to be Treasurer, in a form of words just then. Do you want to be Defence Minister?
I'm not going to walk down this path, Patricia. I'm focused on the job between now and the 21st.
But the government has made the point that we don't know who the Defence Minister will be.
And we don't know who the Health Minister will be if Scott Morrison is re-elected. And if Scott Morrison is re-elected, you can bet London to a brick. There will be some version of a reshuffle which occurs as Prime Ministers will do after they have won elections. So that will be the normal course, whoever wins. But right now there's an election to be won. I'm focused on reconstruction. I'm very excited and energised about...
So you'd like to do that portfolio in government?
I'm really energised about this portfolio. It is, for me, about imagining the kind of economy that we can build that will generate the secure jobs in the future, that will see wages going again, because the standout stat in this economy over the last 9 years is that we've had prolonged wage stagnation. That's why there is a crunch on the cost of living, and that is what we need to fix.
Richard Miles, many thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Patricia.
And let's see what the panel makes of it. Fran Kelly, Gareth Parker and Jennifer Hewitt. Well, we've got a bit of an idea there, I think, on the Labor strategy and what they'll be doing. Fran, what did you make of it?
Well, I suspect he does want to be Defence Minister, but, I guess it's right. There's, in a campaign, how much focus does there need to be on that? But, let's just put that in the mix. Look, I think, you pressed him there on the tax cap. I think what we've seen, Labor, in fact, got a bit of a gift from the Prime Minister, I think, having this extra week of faux campaigning to stress test them. I think they failed that stress test in a couple of points. They failed it when they were asked, will you rule out any new taxes? And for a couple of days, they faffed about with words like, we have no plans for new taxes except the multinational tax. He nailed it exactly right there. But then by then, Jim Chalmers had sort of left open the door of, we're not attracted to the tax cap. So that allows the government another scare campaign. So I think that on a couple of issues, the nurses was another one. Labor should have had, look what happened to their campaign last time around when they were asked off the bat, how are you going to pay for your climate change policies? They didn't seem to have the answer, and that allowed the government to run with that scare campaign. There's a couple of points this time where I think they've fallen at first hurdle, and, they better sharpen things up.
Jennifer, I did press Richard Miles on that. He said, no, we won't be increasing taxes, but he wouldn't commit to the cap. Does that matter?
Well, I think it was a kind of silly mistake. I mean, Jim Chalmers was right. It's a kind of arbitrary figure. But to your point, why give them the opening when you know that that's exactly what the government will do? People don't follow, many people don't follow the exact details of things. But
especially
if you give
tax to GDP caps.
Yes, exactly. But, if you give them an excuse for the government, which of course they've already been using, saying, oh my God, those taxes are going to go up, so it's just silly. And I think that's what the government is clearly relying on. They are relying on a few tactical mistakes, a few errors. We have seen that Albanese is not that good under pressure. and on a campaign, in a campaign, that can actually be quite damaging. I mean, the major point is, of course, there's not that much difference between the parties, and so they're really going to be trying to emphasise, both of them, you know, the differences that are there, which are really not that much, and so therefore, if you make a mistake like that, the government and Morrison is a particularly vicious fighter in that sense, and he's a very effective fighter, and I think that what we've seen this week, as Fran said, is an example of where they're going to be trying to swing at the opposition.
Now, I do wonder whether they've got that Julia Gillard moment. There will be no new tax under a government I lead because, you know, Abbott made such a meal out of that. And I just wonder if they're just trying to avoid that kind of moment in case, you know, there's a lot of spending coming up, for instance.
Got to win one election to win two, though.
Yeah,
So
I know. I'm saying, you know, how they're trying to not fight the last campaign. I'm wondering if they're still not
I think the point is
this
shows exactly why the coalition want to get into this campaign, for exactly the reasons you said. The stress test, I like that term, and I think I agree with your analysis. And they were buoyed when Richard Dreyfus said, Mark Dreyfus said what he said. Richard Dreyfus.
You've made them one man.
Exactly, my apologies. When Mark Dreyfus said what he said, and also when Jim Chalmers said what he said, and this is exactly the point. If, in fact, it's May the 21st as we expect, that is a long, long time away.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of intense daily focus. People get tired, they make mistakes, and you can bet the coalition are absolutely ready to pounce on.
But clearly the government goes in way behind. I want to have a look at those polls. We're about to be inundated by opinion polls. So who better to help us make sense of them than Casey Briggs, who starts a new campaign segment for Insiders called The Crunch. Casey, welcome back to Insiders. What are the polls saying right now?
Hi, PK. Well, here's our brand spanking new touchscreen birthed into the world just in time for this campaign, and we're piping all sorts of data into it, including the national polls. Here is every single poll since the last election from a national pollster. We're talking about 150 and counting from 5 pollsters now. But if we want to understand the story of the polls, I think the better thing to do is not focus on each of these individual data points. We want to look at the trend and what's happening over time. So let's compute that. We're working with Professor Simon Jackman at the University of Sydney to calculate a polling average of the national polls through this campaign. And here is what it looks like. According to the polls, at least, Labor has a commanding lead, just under 55% support in the polls. When you account for the uncertainty, the margins of error in these polls, we're looking at something between 53.6% and 56% for Labor. So the story of the polls in the last 3 years is, well, Labor had a bit of a lead in the two-party preferred polling about the time of the Black Summer bushfires. The coalition regained that lead in the early days of the pandemic, but since about August of 2020, we've seen this long, slow decline in coalition support, at least in the polls. Now, remember, these are not the ABC's polls. This is not a prediction. This is just our best effort at interpreting the polling that has been published. And we have to make some assumptions about these in order to produce this average. The biggest one is that the polls collectively are unbiased. That is, when you combine them all together, they get it right. Here's Professor Simon Jackman.
That assumption was manifestly incorrect in 2019. So it's only as good as the information going in, number one. And number two is, I think it's important to remember that what we're doing is averaging the information available today. We're not necessarily making a prediction.
So that polling miss from 3 years ago, it's unusually large by historical Australian standards. That on the left-hand side, that is the actual election result from 3 years ago. Labor got about 48.5% of the national two-party preferred vote. The national polls, though, going in, were suggesting it might actually be the reverse. Labor might actually get more like 2.9 percentage points higher. So the pollsters have been doing quite a lot of work in the last 3 years to try and wring out that bias, do as much as they can to eliminate it. We saw some encouraging signs in South Australia at the state election there a few weeks ago, but we won't know on a federal stage exactly how much bias is in these national polls until the votes are cast. If this sort of result were to play out on election day, well, what we would actually then expect to see is quite a large lead, a commanding lead for Labor, a convincing win on the sort of scale of which we haven't seen since the 1970s when Malcolm Fraser was PM. We don't really think that's, we think it's quite likely that there will be a bit of tightening up in these polls, though. Here's Simon Jackman again.
I've deployed this same methodology for the last 4 or 5 Australian elections. Over those 4 or 5 election cycles, what you do see is that collectively the industry tends to overstate the Labor vote and the coalition vote tends to recover over the course of the election campaign proper.
And he says what we've seen over the last 15 years or so is that recovery for the coalition is about 2 or 3 percentage points. So, PK, if we were to see that again, if we were to see Labor's vote drop to about here in the polls, well, that would get us right back to the zone where a polling miss the same size as 3 years ago, that would evaporate Labor's lead.
And Casey, you'll be joining Insiders every week until polling day, which I'm delighted to hear. What will you be looking at?
Well, PK, you know probably more than most that the best way to understand the strategies of the contenders here is not necessarily to watch what they say, but watch what they do. And that's exactly what we'll be doing as the leaders crisscross the country, all 151 seats over the coming weeks. And that crisscrossing has been going for quite some time. They've been setting a frenetic pace. Here is just where the leaders have been travelling, Morrison and Albanese, in just the past week. The Prime Minister has spent quite a lot of time in New South Wales visiting some key seats like Dobell and Robertson, also some key Sydney seats like Parramatta. That's a seat that's held by Labor on a margin of 3.5%. The government would hope to pick that up. Mr Albanese and the Labor campaign have been travelling a bit wider. They've gone as far as Perth to key seats like Hasluck and Swan, also to South Australia and the seat of Boothby. So we'll wipe this map pretty soon to track where the leaders are going through the campaign weeks ahead, just as soon as one very important engagement takes place, and that is the Prime Minister driving down Dunrossell Drive to this place here, Government House, where the election campaign will be formally declared.
Thank you, Casey. And I think we've got some live pictures now. The Prime Minister's plane is about to land in Canberra. It's not a very long flight. Obviously, Sydney and Canberra are very close to each other. He will then land and then make that drive to Government House, where he will call the election, we believe, for May the 21st. Let's just go to the polling situation. Really excellent analysis, I thought, there by Casey, which we'll be all tuning into every week. But just walk me through it, Gareth. WA. Yep. Labor's in the hunt in WA. There's a popular premier there. I understand Anthony Albanese spent the week hanging out with him. Talk to me about the lay of the land there.
I think it's interesting that Anthony Albanese, excuse me, decided to visit Hasluck, held by Ken Wyatt, of course. Both the Labor and Liberal people that I speak to, plugged into the campaigns on the ground, are talking really about Pearce and Swan as 1A and 1B. For the Labor Party, they are the absolute focus. They have been for this will be the 4th election in a row. I've been hearing all about Pearce and Swan, and each time they've failed to take them. In the past election, there were predictions, Labor will pick up 3, 4, 5 seats. It hasn't happened. They've only really picked up Cowan in recent elections. But we've got 2 retiring members, Christian Porter and Pearce, of course, and he's had all sorts of problems. Steve Irons, a popular local member, close to the Prime Minister, retiring in Swan. What I'm hearing is that Steve Irons is still very active in the campaign in Swan, and that the Liberal candidate, Christy McSweeney, is seen to be sort of his successor. It's generational change. That's what they're selling to the local people. Zanita Mascarenhas, the Labor Party candidate, is a local person and has good connections. I get the sense that Labor are most optimistic about Pearce. They are optimistic about Swan. And then everything else is a nice to have rather than a must have. I think if they pick up those 2 seats, the West Australian Labor campaign will feel that they've done their job. Hasluck, they're less optimistic about, but they are causing a few troubles for others in seats like Moore and also Tangney too.
We've got some pictures live on the screen now of the Prime Minister's plane landing in Canberra. He will, of course, there we go. Touchdown is literally about, yep. Touchdowns happened. The Prime Minister is officially in Canberra. He will, of course, shortly end that taxiing. He will then get in his car and drive to Yarralumla and officially call the election. We will be in no longer the fake campaign, but the campaign proper. We expect him to talk this morning, Fran, and he will be making that opening pitch. You know, I suspect it will be a bit of a who do you trust moment. Yeah. Do you agree? He'll use the Howard playbook. As you often say on the Party Room podcast, people should listen.
It's true.
It's the Howard playbook.
it's a leaf right out of the Howard playbook, as we've discussed earlier. Just a point on the polls, and I love that new tracker that Casey's got. I'm looking forward to it. But one factor that I think they have to put in is that, yes, the Prime Minister hasn't been in Perth, but Josh Frydenberg has, hasn't he, Gareth? And this is something. There's a whole lot of seats that the Prime Minister really can't visit, as Katie Allen said, the member for Higgins. They're not happy with the Prime Minister. Another Liberal in a inner city Melbourne seat said, the Prime Minister's on the nose here. The same goes probably for a seat like Pearce, perhaps.
Well, and I think that probably the Prime Minister plays better in Pearce, but for somewhere like Curtin, it was Josh Frydenberg who launched Celia Hammond's campaign this week.
He's launching the Higgins campaign today.
Exactly. Josh Frydenberg's almost doing the heavy lifting in the inner city electorates.
I don't think we'll see the Prime Minister in Wentworth, or probably not in North Sydney.
No, we will see the Prime Minister in all the regional seats and the outer suburban seats.
Yeah, as he's been doing this last week.
Yes.
So New South Wales is really interesting. Obviously, right to the last minute, the pre-selection debacle. But then, if you look at where the Prime Minister's been hanging out, he was even in the Hunter, where he got sort of a bit of a spray from a pensioner who was not happy with him. Quite a difficult moment on the campaign trail this week for him. I consider it the campaign trail. But what's that all about, Jennifer? He's obviously on the hunt for marginal Labor seats.
Well, that's right. I think the government is hoping that they can pick up seats, in the Hunter, for example, and that it is still, despite the self-inflicted wounds of the New South Wales Liberal Party, it is possible to still find some fertile territory for the government's particular, and Morrison in particular, his appeal to people in seats who are not almost the opposite in that sense of the Wentworth seat, where he, that's right, as Fran said, he will not be going anywhere near there. But people saying, oh look, here are the tradies, here are the jobs you can have, here's the resources industry, this is all great, isn't Australia great, that type of thing. So I think we will see that type of offensive kind of campaign from the Liberal Party. And to the extent that you had, that particular pensioner, I mean, really, frankly, that can happen in any election. Let's never forget, Bob Hawke back in 1989, silly old bugger. I mean, really, these things, but I think that the government cannot afford to be spooked by that.
But it is how you handle those moments, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, the famous image of the Latham-Howard handshake, those moments on the campaign trail, they are unpredictable, so who is better placed in the sort of attention...
It's a temperament issue.
Exactly.
Well, they're just moments which people clock into because they get replayed and replayed, and they can really, re-emphasise the narrative about you, as the Mark Latham did, a sort of a negative narrative or a positive one.
Yes.
That's you got to. I hope, presumably, both leaders have been sort of road testing how they're going to do this.
Now, we are bringing you the live pictures on the screen of the Prime Minister's aeroplane taxiing in Canberra, and of course that means touchdown has very much happened, and he will be driving to the Governor-General. This is all going to unfold in the next period of time, and ABC News will continue after we're finished, of course, bringing people the latest on today. So, Fran, Queensland is often very volatile, and this is a very, very important place where Labor really struggled at the last election too. The Prime Minister's pitch has very much been focused on those kinds of voters, right? I mean, if you think about the way he's been casting himself, it's very focused in the regions as well.
It's true. I mean, Labor bought themselves a whale of trouble last time because they lost so badly in Queensland. So many of the seats there that they might have thought they'd have a hope of winning an election where they were ahead in the polls. The gap is so big that they're not going to make many inroads. I think even Labor is hopeful they might get Flynn. We've got a retiring member. The government similarly hopeful they could hold on to it. But there's not going to be a swag of seats. Labor, with the negativity around Scott Morrison that's really, increased over the last few months, are hopeful that they might pick up some of those those Brisbane seats, a couple of Brisbane seats. But, there's not a lot. I don't think there's a lot expected to change hands in Queensland. But, as Jennifer was mentioning earlier, before we came on air, there's a big question mark over Queensland in particular, and that's the Clive Palmer vote, the UAP vote.
Glad you raised that.
The money that he is going to be pouring in. Last time it was very clear in the last few weeks of the campaign that he was spent a fortune on advertising against Bill Shorten, which really just equated to government advertising. What's he going to do?
So what is he going to do? He did speak at the press club. Do we have a stronger picture of the way those preferences will actually land?
It's what we do have a clear picture of. It's not going to be as clear-cut as it was last time, which can have completely benefited the coalition. And it's not just Queensland. It's, you know, seats in Victoria as well. And you have
billboards right through New South Wales.
And so you have, ridiculous, economic arguments about, let's all have 3% interest rates and let's have all the superannuation money spent here and 15% tax on iron ore. So they're trying to kind of get, and I think there will be quite a few people who vote for that, but rather than saying this will all go to the coalition, I think it'll be a bit more mixed this time. And I'm not sure what's going to happen with it. You have to say it is probably going to benefit the coalition a little bit more, but you wouldn't.
I think the exception might be Western Australia when it comes to Palmer. He's so unpopular because of the border challenge that all of the advertising money which is happening, I actually don't think it helped Palmer, and I certainly don't think it helps the coalition, because Mark McGowan did an excellent job at establishing the link in the public's mind that Clive Palmer and Scott Morrison are working together to try and bring down the WA hard border. Now, hopefully we've moved beyond that issue a bit, but I don't think that actually benefits the coalition in WA.
No, I think that's right. I think Western Australia is yet again the exception.
But you also mentioned...
Gareth, you are the exceptional panellist.
You also mentioned the premiers. I mean, are the premiers going to be Anthony Albanese's secret weapon? He's been standing alongside a couple of really popular premiers, hasn't he? Mark McGowan, Malinauskas in South Australia. You know, how much is that going to help?
It's a really interesting one,
Scott Morrison doesn't have that many friends amongst them.
And Labor's campaign is, I didn't mean to, but he's premised on this idea that he can hang out with them because not only are they Labor people, but he's well liked, but that Scott Morrison is, and one person put it to me, poison with some of these people.
And in fact, it became a bit of a subplot in WA a couple of weeks ago when the Prime Minister was in town and he stood side by side with Mark McGowan, and there were some Labor people really upset about that, saying, well, now the Prime Minister's got the nice pictures next to Mark McGowan, which he can use in campaigning material. That's really unhelpful to us. So, which I thought was a bit overblown, but that is what the view
adage,
was.
you know, people vote one way in the federal election, then take insurance out in the state election. I don't know whether...
Well, of course, the interesting thing is New South Wales as well.
Just to interrupt this conversation, we've got the pictures. This is the Prime Minister walking down the stairs, of course, from his plane. He's in Canberra. He's about to enter the car where he will, of course, make that very important and significant drive to Government House, where he will ask for the federal election to be called. Of course, he's up against the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese. It's the first time Anthony Albanese has gone to the federal election as leader, so untested in terms of running for Prime Minister. Scott Morrison now in the car. He's landed in Canberra. He is now going to make a drive to Government House. Now, I know Canberra pretty well, living there a decade. That's about a 15-minute drive.
There's a marathon on this morning, though, PK. It could slow things down a little.
Thank you, Fran, for that. I didn't... OK, so maybe a bit longer. Let's see if they get a bit of VIP. They are VIP cars and get faster traction to the Governor-General's house. The way it works is, at least 15 minutes, maybe perhaps a little longer. The Prime Minister will drive to Government House and ask for the election. Has a cup of tea, as they say. I don't know if they have coffee, decaf. I'm not sure what they'll want to drink. With the Governor-General, he will then make the drive. There usually is a period of time. Let's just go through how the sausage is made, Fran. There's a period of time, not long, and then the Prime Minister will speak and make his pitch.
He'll speak in the Prime Minister's courtyard. The journalists are all there waiting, and then he'll give us the pitch. As you say, will it be who do you trust? It's kind of that kind of message, or don't risk, I think, is perhaps what we're going to hear more of. I imagine we'll hear Anthony Albanese's name mentioned a few times, as Gareth said, which is a little unusual. But yeah, that's the process, and that'll happen probably mid-morning, or a little later, towards noon, and then off we go.
And so, Gareth, that will be quite a key moment. It's the beginning of the campaign. The campaigns are very set. They practice this, the key messages. Will Scott Morrison's main mantra be, don't take the risk?
Absolutely. And I think that that is the main message. It's like, well, look at what we've been through. And you saw it in the campaign ad that was released last night. Oh, well, look, we had imperfect information, or we didn't get everything right. There's almost a hint of the apology there. Look, we did our best, we didn't get everything right, but, we've learned a lot, and we've got through it together, and the pandemic was really tough, and
how good is Australia?
The economy's great, and how about those young kids putting their hands up to run small businesses, and, I'm sort of Captain Australia. So I think that very much will be the pitch, and I know that they are very keen to invite that comparison, as I said earlier. That's really what this is going to be about. It'll be compare the pair. lest I use the M-word, marketing, almost like a shopping list and a consumer-oriented campaign. Who do you prefer? What are the features? What's the price tag?
Now, we've messed with the format a little because the Prime Minister landed in Canberra to call an election, so that's fair enough. I haven't, smashed the program. David, it'll be fine for you next week. No, he's watching. He will be back.
He'll be watching.
He'll be watching. But certainly, we've unfortunately not able to bring you talking pictures with Mike Bowers. We will have it on iView, though. It's an excellent segment, so please look for it on iView. We will shortly cross to ABC News coverage of the unfolding day, the election 2022 being called. But I think final observations make sense about now, Fran.
Final observations. In the last week, last few weeks really, in amongst all that's been trailing out in this faux campaign, the government has been releasing people, refugees who have been in detention in various hotels around the country. Some have been in detention for 8-9 years, but the Medivac, those who came here on the Medivac process, they've been let out in dribs and drabs. The last 8 got out of that park hotel in Melbourne just on Friday, I think. There's been some analysis, commentary around why they're doing that. Is it because they're in a campaign trying to get the barnacles off, as John Howard might say? So I'm wondering whether Alex Hawke, who's the Immigration Minister, will take that big step and finally give the Billa-Wheeler family a visa and allow them to go back to Billa-Wheeler.
Interesting. Gareth?
Tangney, held by Ben Morton, the Special Minister of State and Prime Minister's right-hand man, is not a target seat for Labor, but they're certainly keen to cause trouble there. Labor's candidate is a former West Australian policeman, Sam Lim, with Chinese-Malaysian heritage, has excellent contacts into those multicultural communities in that seat, in part because of the work he did during COVID as a WA police liaison. Now, a Labor person told me yesterday that he did a fundraiser this week with 1,000 people donating $1,000. And this Labor person said, sorry, $1,000 or $100? No, $1,000.
That's a lot of money.
They want to get Ben Morton off the plane and back into his electorate.
OK, Jennifer, final word.
Well, the last election we had, during the last term of government rather, we had an economy that performed far better than anybody expected. No matter who wins government this time, the economy is going to be a much harder ask even than it has been, mainly because of the imported geopolitical problems, which are not just geopolitical risk and politics and wars, but also great economic risks and inflation.
Well, that's it for Insiders, but stay with the ABC for ongoing coverage as the Prime Minister heads to Government House to call the election. And we will be crossing, of course, to that coverage. Greg Jennett and Jane Norman will bring you that coverage. But we'll leave you with Anthony Albanese's kind offer. Now, he was very much this week pushing the Prime Minister to call the election, and it was quite a moment where he messed up exactly where Government House was. But we're now throwing to Greg Jennett and Jane Norman, who take over to bring us the ABC coverage of election 2022. Thanks for watching.
What a goal for the Matildas! There it is, it's over! Does the streak continue? It does!
That is unbelievable.
That is fine. The Demons are premiers! Asparty, Australian Open champion.
Hello and welcome to Offsiders. It's hard to believe that only 6 years ago, 2 of our biggest sporting codes had yet to launch a women's competition. But in a short space of time, the AFLW and NRLW has exceeded the expectations of many. Today, it's the 4th instalment of the Women's NRL Grand Final. Brisbane will host the first All-Sydney decider between the Dragons and the Roosters. Yesterday, the Adelaide Crows celebrated the AFLW's first dynasty, claiming their 3rd premiership in 6 years.
And she does! Opening goal of the grand final to Hewitt. Numbers front and centre here for Adelaide. In swoops Phillips and kicks Adelaide second.
Goal goes wide, but picking it off is Bannon. She's going to run in for their first. That's the lift they need, the D's. It's Spark on an X Factor in Bannon. Oh, it's Horde. She's taken the mark. They need this one. And she's done the damage. But over the top, unopposed. Ponce can take the grab. She wants to move it quickly. Thought she was too far out to score. Takes a bounce. Goalwood. Can she seal it? Just about.
The dominant force becomes a dynasty. The Adelaide Crows are champions of the AFLW for the third time.
Can you be my captain?
I can be your captain, yeah? Sounds good.
So the Crows holding off a fast-finishing Melbourne Football Club. Our panellists this morning, Alistair Nicholson, Caroline Wilson and Jamie Pandaram in Sydney. Al, we might start with you. They've been utterly dominant, the Adelaide Crows, for the first 6 years, but maybe not for too much longer.
Yeah, they've been the star side for the first few years of AFLW, and we're about to go to the fully fledged model, aren't we, when every team comes into the competition. But to win 3 premierships in 6 years, extraordinary achievements. They've done it with a really rock-solid side. There was a lot of premiership experience out there yesterday for the Adelaide Crows, whereas Melbourne had 19 players who'd never played in a grand final before. I think that showed a little bit as much as the Demons tried to fight it out. In the end, the Adelaide defence was really strong and some lovely moments within the game as well. So, yeah, look forward to it going to 18 teams. I know it's going to have a bit of an impact on the style of play for a while, but I think ultimately that's going to be a good thing long term.
We saw AFLW front page in Adelaide and front page in Melbourne this morning. Erin Phillips, Caro, I mean, she's got the best CV in sport at the moment. She's a 2-time Olympian. She's a world champion winner in basketball, 2-time WNBA champion and now a 3-time AFLW champion. But is the dynasty over? Has she played her last game for the Crows?
Well, I'm not going to write off Matthew Clark's team just because Erin is leaving, but he will leave, I believe. She'll be leading Port Adelaide next year. Port Adelaide are really, really keen to put her on as a development coach in this new system. The AFL is mandating for at least 8 clubs, I think it is, or 9 clubs, I should say, with women development coaches. But they want her to play for at least 1 year, wear her father Greg's colours. It'll be fabulous. She might take Ebony Marinoff and a couple others with her. I still think that what Matthew Clark has done in taking over from Beck Goddard, who of course is their inaugural premiership coach, has been fabulous. And I'm not going to write off Adelaide, but I will say that it was great. Beck was one of the commentators in yesterday's coverage. She coached the first team. Then, of course, like all the other women coaches, lost her job. I'm just so pleased that she's back as a senior coach when Hawthorn comes into the competition. We think at the end of August this year. And culturally, that has got to change. What else has to change is, can we please name something after Erin Phillips?
Yes.
Probably the W, as it's rather pathetically called at the moment. And I'm not discounting what it means to the girls and what a fabulous night their presentation night was earlier this week. But and Daisy's been wonderful, and she'll have something named after her too. But when you see the MVP, you know, Hatchard get the MVP, it's just not the same, is it? So I think we name the W, I think, has to be named after Erin, with respect to all the pioneers going back to the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree as well. And it was great yesterday, the blockbuster between, you know, obviously Erin and Daisy, and the question marks now over what Daisy Pearce does and whether they can talk her into going
Geelong are very confident that they've got her working under Chris Scott as a development coach. But the way she's played this season, she could go around one more time.
She could. She was named All-Australian earlier this week. Jamie, it's a few years behind the NRLW, but obviously the grand final is today. How big is the momentum swing for NRLW in the northern states at the moment?
Yeah, it's certainly increasing, Kelly. I mean, the broadcast is up 30% on last season. So, you know, they're averaging about 70,000 viewers for the big games, 60,000 for the regular rounds. I imagine that'll get it past 100 today for the grand final. You know, and they're increasing the competition. So it's 6 teams at the moment. Back-to-back seasons this year, of course, because last year was cancelled. They'll increase it to 8 teams in 23 and then 10 teams in 2024. So, yeah, momentum is building. You know, the fans are there. The broadcasters are very happy with the numbers. And State of Origin is also being increased from 1 game to 2 games from next year. So, yeah, all the momentum is on an uplift, and we're starting to see the superstars emerge as well. You know, you talk about the AFLW stars. Well, you know, we've got certainly some stars emerging in the rugby league ranks, players like Emma Tonagato, Jess Sergis. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that translates to, you know, CBA negotiations and player increased pay for the next couple of seasons.
So this is Tonagato. We're seeing her, the Dragons star fullback, who'll be in action in this grand final earlier today. Rugby Sevens was really leading the way when it came to professionalism in women's sport, particularly on the back of the the Australian team winning the gold at the Rio Olympics. But the pandemic means globally that sort of brought a stop and a halt to that sport, and we've seen them all switch to NRLW. Are they going to stay in NRLW as a result of this?
Yeah, I think a fair amount of them will. I mean, you know, the Sevens series, it's global, so you're playing in a different country every week. So that became impossible during the COVID lockdowns and the border closures. So Rugby Australia was quite happy for some of their stars to go to rugby league during that period where they couldn't play any games. But now that you see the momentum building in NRLW, you know, Emma Tonegata was one of the biggest Aussie Seven stars who's now gone on to become Player of the Year in her first year of NRLW. You know, you correlate that with, you know, what is expected to be increased pay, you know, set games, you know, no risk of overseas travel, you know, shutting down a competition. They can still play in a bubble if we have another lockdown. Those sort of things lead me to think that there'll be a fair few rugby stars who just stay in rugby league now. I mean, we've had the two players of the year this year, Millie Boyle and Emma Tonegata, both come from rugby union.
And what about, Caro, the negotiations over a new CBA for the AFLW? Obviously, we're going to the all-18 teams starting in August. The Players Association has sent a wish list to the AFL. They're going to sit down over 2 days later this week. There's speculation they've asked for 150% pay rise, so a minimum of $50,000, a maximum of $90,000 a year, that the contract hours they want from 13 hours a week up to 22 hours a week over a 12-month period, and that they want, this will be a sticking point, they want 12 to 14 rounds later this year, and I think Gillon McLachlan's very strong on 10. How do you see this one playing out?
Oh, I don't think they'll get 12 to 14 rounds. I think the structure is what fascinates me. It won't be a cricket-style arrangement. The male players are not going to share the spoils of their next CBA with the women. That was made clear when Nat Fyfe was asked about it and just changed the subject a few weeks ago on Melbourne Radio 3AW. I think that what will happen is that, and there's a push led by Steve Hocking, who, of course, has gone back into a club but ran the AFL's football operation for several years, to shorten the men's lists, perhaps down to 35, 34, 35, and with that small amount of extra money, put it into the women. But look, they're doing it on the fly. I mean, they don't have long to get this done, and that's what always happens. It seems to happen again and again. I just wish there were more women sitting on that AFLPA players board, because I
there's
think
only 2 at the moment.
Yeah, they need better representation.
They do. Yeah, I agree with you on that. Just finally on the NRLW competition, the grand final later today, I do love this storyline. You touched on Matthew Clark, and he spoke beautifully afterwards, the AFLW coach for the Adelaide Crows, after they won yesterday. Jamie Soward, this is an amazing story. He's the Dragons coach, a former premiership player in 2010 for this club. He spoke this week saying, I hated the person NRL turned me into. Footy made me selfish. I was arrogant. And as of today, I'm going to come full circle, because the father of 2 daughters, there they are, he's going to coach the Dragons in their first women's grand final and try and win their first premiership. So there's lovely stories littered like that throughout both codes of AFL and NRL players getting involved in the women's game. Now, COVID continues to cause chaos in Australian sport, to the point that some think that it's threatening or compromising the integrity of the AFL competition. We've seen this with the West Coast Eagles over the first 3 rounds. Winless, decimated because of a lot of positive cases. They've used 37 players in 4 rounds, 14 changes one week, 12 changes the next. Winless heading in yesterday against the Pies, missing a third of their players, and they produced a heroic against all odds victory. Got to say, this club has handled itself really well, Al.
That's a win full of character and under extremely difficult circumstances. And I think when COVID first hit and West Coast had to go on the road, they probably made the mistake of letting it consume them, and it probably affected their performance. They're not letting that happen this time around, albeit up against the harshest of circumstances, I think. So to beat Collingwood, a side that's shown a bit this season under a new coach in Craig McRae, that was a very good win for the West Coast Eagles, and I feel for them. It's not their fault that their state didn't open up as earlier as other states. Of course, they're going through an increased number of COVID cases in Western Australia at the moment, but the AFL has decided it's got to draw a line in the sand, and games have to be played no matter how many players you are without. But it would seem 14 players missing against North Melbourne. That seemed too many to me. I thought that was extremely harsh on the Eagles, that they couldn't find a way of pushing that game back.
Yeah, but they were still competitive, weren't they? And no one will be happier about yesterday's result than the AFL, because they'll say, look, we spoke to Adam Simpson before the game and I asked, if you can get so many reasonable players fronting up and making a game of it, you know, surely Tasmania gets a team. And he said, I haven't had time to think about anything. But, I mean, he's had four players play in every game.
Yeah.
One of them being Patrick Naish, who back in early February was trying to get a game with the Saints, and he suddenly finds himself a West Coast Eagle. He's one of only 4 all-game players. To see Willie Rioli come back the way he has, as you say, a win on the road, you know, made it even more extraordinary. That's the upset of the season for me.
We might have seen goal of the year in the AFL. We might have seen try of the year in the NRL. We'll have a look at the try of the year shortly. But first of all, I think Shea Bolton, the Tigers' excitement machine, he won Mark of the Year last year. He's going for the full set here, Caro. Is this a contender for goal of the year, the best one we've seen so far?
Absolutely, it is goal of the year so far. I'm not saying I hope it does get bettered, because I want to see what that goal looks like. This was absolutely sensational, and as he said after the game, completely deliberate. He looked in the goal square, couldn't see anyone and had a crack.
I would be amazed if that gets bettered. That was amazing. I did the game live last night. To see him swoop on the ball, to read the play the way he did, and then to finish from the boundary line in the pocket like that, I think it's going to be a very, very special goal that tops that one.
It was a
Jack Leavolt's barrel at three-quarter time was
that was
pretty special as well.
To move past his brother, or equal his brother Nick.
His cousin.
I should say.
Yeah, and the Dogs, last year's finalists, in a bit of trouble. They're inaccurate at the moment, so they're just 1 and 3. Racism continues to be an issue in the AFL, and it's back in the spotlight after Caro's piece about Cyril Rioli in The Age last week. Today marks the return of Adelaide Crows goal kicker Taylor Walker after a 6-week suspension due to a racial slur. Now, during the week, this tweet from the Crows social media team raised a few eyebrows. Look who's back, with the sunglasses emoji. And the casual tone of this post certainly didn't impress the coach, Matthew Nicks.
Yeah, disappointed. That was a miss. That was a big miss. And we're people make mistakes. That was a miss. This is a guy who's been out in the community, spent time up at Port Augusta, and got away and got in amongst the community and amongst the people and just educated himself and others. He took others with him at the same time. He's done the work. And when I have conversations with our players, which I do every week, every single player I'll talk to minimum once a week. That's part of my job, is to make sure that we're connected and we're on the same page.
Jamie, I might come to you first on this as an outsider watching on. Should Taylor Walker be playing at the Docklands against Essendon later today?
Yeah, I mean, he's served his time. I don't think there's I don't have any issue with him returning. It's just the insensitivity around the marketing behind his return. I can't understand how, you'd understand when people are returning after a controversy like this, that it will be the big issue of the week. How they couldn't have managed this better, how they couldn't have come up with even some sort of video of text explaining how he may have improved as a person, what he may have learnt in his time away, as opposed to putting, sunglasses emoji on and saying he's back. That speaks to, some disorganisation, as a club. They clearly haven't had the conversations and worked in depth with how to manage that process better. So it's really disappointing, because it speaks again to the casual element of it. I mean, it's such a serious issue. All codes, society is grappling with it. Yeah, I just think it's really disappointing that, they blamed it on some part-time social media person there. Really, that was a key moment for the club, and they just bungled it. I don't have any problem with him returning to the game. If they said that that's the amount of time he should serve, that's fine. What has he learnt in that time? That's what we should have been hearing this week.
Spot on, Jamie. I mean, Matthew Nicks, along with the other bosses at the club, Tim Silvers and Adam Kelly, haven't really put a foot wrong since this happened, in my view. They've said and done all the right things. I'm surprised he's come back straight away, but that disconnect, that they weren't all over this issue last week, really shocked me. And to even see Tanya Hosh, and the AFL don't put Tanya Hosh up very much, or Paulie Vandenberg, their new sort of number 2 under Tanya at the AFL, who worked for many years at Port Adelaide in this space, for her to say, let's just hope he shows some humility when he does come back. I thought that was a really pointed statement towards the Crows and towards Taylor.
Yeah, you broke the Cyril Rioli racism story a week ago in The Age about the reasons behind why one of the AFL's most loved players left suddenly at Hawthorn. His uncle, Michael Long, has spoken since, saying it's been blown out of proportion, and he says it's got nothing to do with colour. This is a very delicate and complicated situation. How have you seen it unfold over the last 7 days since you initially broke this story?
Well, to go back to the start, Kelly, I think what Cyril did was very brave. Not many Indigenous footballers speak up and say negative things about their experiences, particularly successful ones. And we saw what happened to Adam Goodes. And very few have done anything, put their head up since. So I'm sad that they've come for Cyril, although he predicted to me that would happen. We know that there seems to... I was aware there was a family feud involving Michael Long. I completely disagree with Michael Long that this has nothing to do with race. I think he's shown a real lack of understanding in this situation. And, you know, to personally attack Cyril seems to me a bit disappointing. But no one wants to be seen as the angry black man. And so many people I've spoken to this week have said that. And you've got a lot of senior good footy people at Hawthorn at that time, going back to their former president, Andrew Newbold, their former CEO, Stuart Fox, now in very senior positions elsewhere, Luke Hodge and all that leadership group, devastated, shattered, but also very keen to protect their dynasty. And as I said, their legacy. Yeah. And as I said, Alistair, this happens in football so often. There is a touch of the Oko owners about this. They blame the woman. You know, there's a lot of people briefing behind the scenes about Shannon Rioli. Just because Cyril has an opinionated, strong wife who feels strongly about this, does that make his opinions any less?
Absolutely not. The question people are raising is around the comment Jeff Kennett made about Shannon wearing a pair of ripped jeans. An inappropriate comment, but some people say they don't believe that was racially motivated in any way. It's just a throwaway, foolish line by someone with poor judgment. Do you arrive at the conclusion that was racist?
No, I don't. And I don't even think the Riolis think it was racist. What they're trying to explain is that this was the final straw. And people say to me, why did you lead the story on that? And I said, well, because that's the reason they left. That shows how, I suppose, bad they were feeling about their own current situation, that was the final straw that broke the camel's back. And I'm not saying Jeff Kennett made a racially motivated comment, but we can't understand why that comment makes them feel belittled and humiliated, as they said to me when I spoke to them for this story. How can I understand why? Of course, my father makes those comments to my kids all the time. And Jeff couldn't understand it, and the failure to try and understand that and the decision by the club to cover it up at the time has led to this.
Let's move on to the NRL, because there was plenty of drama in the Parramatta Eels Gold Coast Titans game on the Gold Coast last night, Jamie. The Eels survived a scare. They won 26-20. Look at this big hit. Junior Paulo delivered on AJ Brimson that had the rugby league world buzzing. He was sin-binned. Everyone, including his coach, Jamie Brad Arthur, said this was a good tackle.
Yeah, and traditionally it would have been a good tackle, but now we know what we know about concussion. Protecting the head area is a must. Rugby union's gone through this a few years ago. This sits in that grey area because the initial contact was shoulder on shoulder, but there is then contact to the head. I suspect what we're seeing now is resistance from the old school. About what is a solid hard tackle. We need to keep the game hard and tough, but we are transitioning into understanding the long-term effects of concussion and CTE, and I think more and more we will see these 50-50 situations penalised. I feel a little bit for Junior Paulo in this situation because the player was lowering himself coming into contact, but again, what I've observed from rugby union, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, is that is a penalty. It's not in the red card territory because it wasn't intentional. The initial contact wasn't to the head. But, as we see more and more, lawsuits come into play from players that are affected by concussion issues, the more games will have to start to crack down on stuff like this.
So, Jamie, do you think that it's just going to reach a point where it's legislated that if you choose to tackle in that manner, and there is a head clash as a result of it, or some form of injury to the head as a result of it, you're ultimately responsible for making that decision in the first place?
Yeah, interestingly enough, rugby union is transitioning away to making the ball carrier more responsible. They found that 75% of concussions happen because of the body position of the ball carrier. But, again, these 50-50 ones are difficult because, of mitigating circumstances. There's someone around the legs, so he's dropping. But yes, if you're going to make any contact with the head, and you can't get yourself into a position to go get any lower than the shoulder position, you are ultimately responsible.
We mentioned that we saw goal of the year in the AFL. Is this the try of the year so far? Have a look at this. The Titans player, David Fafita. The commentator says this is half man, half farm machinery. That's got to be the commentary line of the year, doesn't it? David Fafita, absolutely unstoppable, and that's why he's worth the big dollars to the Gold Coast Titans. The Eels, like I said, just survived the scare. They're top 4 material this year. It was a good game. Very quickly, Jamie, on Cameron Munster, I mean, he's one of the biggest, probably the best players in the competition at the moment. He helped the Melbourne Storm to a 30-16 win over the Raiders in Wagga Wagga yesterday, but Wayne Bennett, he's going to swagger on into town and have a chat to Cameron Munster this week because it's been reported that he's not happy with the Melbourne Storm offer.
Well, they've rejected the initial offer. His agent, Braithen Astor, has already said that it was, nowhere near the ballpark of what he expects. Cameron Munster is expected to earn, $1 million plus in his next contract, and he deserves that. Looking at the market, I mean, we looked at what David Fafita did. He's on a 1.1 million. Munster is that influential that he deserves to be a 7-figure player. But the Storm have made a lot of re-signings of late: Ryan Pappenhausen, Jerome Hughes, Harry Grant. So they can't stay within the salary cap and still offer Munster $1 million. And this is where old master coach Bennett will swoop in. He's looking to build a roster with the Dolphins who will come into the comp next year. He's had meetings with Kalen Ponga. He sent out a lot of superstars and really lucked out. Munster would be the big name signing. I mean, he is a Queenslander, so he's still on contract for 23. Whether he breaks that contract or joins the Dolphins in 24, but I would expect Munster to be leaving the Melbourne Storm. There's just no way that they can retain him, by staying under the cap.
To the US Masters, Al, day 3 is nearly over. Despite very, very difficult conditions, Australian star Cameron Smith is still in contention.
Yeah, absolutely. He shot the round of the day today, Kelly. Started the tournament so well, but he had a double bogey on the first and a double bogey on 18 in round 1. Had a bit of a difficult second round, but in round 3 he shot a 4-under par 68, Cameron Smith, and he's rocketed right back up the leaderboard, so he's only 3 off the pace, and it was very windy. His round was the round of the day by 2 shots, so a superb performance from this young Queenslander. And I know he's got to get a lot right, but the idea of him wearing the green Masters jacket with that mullet trailing down the back of it, that would be quite a piece of imagery. So Smith's in a really good spot. Scotty Scheffler bogeyed the last hole. He'd driven the ball so well all day, but he missed the fairway on the last. He took a bogey and he ultimately finished it 1 under par today. He's 9 under for the tournament. Smith is 6 and Sung Jae Im is at 4 under. Here's Charles Schwartzel on the 10th. He got to 6 under with this, so that would have put him right in the mix, but he dropped shots late. He's 2 under par overall for the tournament. So an eagle on the 10th for Schwartzel was the highlight of the day.
And yet, Alistair, the lead golf story overnight internationally was Tiger's still in contention, which surely not.
Amazing. He felt he could win this tournament. I think it's a triumph that he just made the cut, to be honest. You can see him walking around the golf course, how he's still impacted by the serious injuries sustained in that horrific car crash he was involved in. But he's added a dimension to this tournament. Whenever he's at the Masters at Augusta, he is a player that everyone can't take their eyes off, even if he is essentially getting around on one leg, basically. He's played some very good golf despite the circumstances. His putting, those let him down a little bit.
Yeah, he shot his worst ever round at the tournament earlier today. But as you say, I mean, it's an absolute miracle that he's even there. The one thing that stood out watching it to me, no phones, no mobile phones allowed.
Wasn't it fantastic?
Can we just allow that at every sporting event around the world? Because imagine everyone running onto the SCG with Buddy without holding their phones.
Actually looking at what was happening.
Yeah, I know.
Grumpy old people, aren't we? I thoroughly agree. It annoyed me so much about that Buddy moment. All of those phones. Just have a look. Just remember it.
Yeah, and just finally the Matildas. I mean, this is one of Australia's most popular National teams at the moment, 18 months out from hosting the FIFA World Cup. They're organising a series of friendlies back home. On Friday night, they hosted New Zealand in Townsville. The Football Ferns look set to beat Australia for the first time in 1994. They led 1-0, and then there was two stoppage time goals. Emily Van Egmond first, and then guess who? Sam Kerr. So they got the win, 2-1, all thanks to Sam Kerr. I think it was in the 96th minute, which is extraordinary, and they play again on Tuesday night in Canberra. Final tip or observation?
Well, after a couple of years without the Australian Formula One Grand Prix in Melbourne, it's back, and it's back in a really big way. They've had over 100,000 people there every day, expecting 130,000 there today, so I think 420 all told for this event. Melburnians have flocked back to it. They've missed it. And this was interesting. So here is Sebastian Vettel putting out a fire or an overheating issue with his car, and then he borrowed one of the Marshals' scooters and entered the course illegally. So he's been fined about 5,000 euros for that. He can drive a race car at 300 k's an hour. He can put out a fire, but he can't ride a moped at 15 k's an hour.
What do those attendance figures tell us compared to the AFL, which have been a little bit down? I mean, I'm just loving that there's fans back at games.
Is it outdoors? I mean, it was disappointing at the AFLW Grand Final last week. We will not see those numbers at Marvel Stadium next Friday, Kel. The McLaughlin administration has got rid of many traditions, some of them understandably, but the decision to introduce football on Good Friday, certainly in Victoria, has not worked. I don't think the right clubs are involved. I know North Melbourne deserved to go, but the games have never captured our imagination, and it's diluted the traditional of many decades Good Friday appeal here in Victoria. So big cross from me. No, it's not a popular view though.
Okay. Jamie?
Well, it's another tournament, another meltdown by Nick Kyrgios. He got knocked out in Houston by Riley Opelka and had a shot at the umpires yet again. It just seems like he's doing as much whinging as playing tennis these days. It's getting a bit tired.
All right. Thank you very much for coming in today. That is the program for the week. We are going to leave you with the Melbourne Boomers celebrating their first WNBL title in 11 years, overcoming the Perth Lynx by 19 points in Game 3. So it went to the deciding Game 3 of the final series, and it was Coach Guy Malloy's last game in charge. He almost didn't get his hands on the trophy after it went missing on the flight from Perth back to Melbourne. See you next Sunday.
He'll get his hands on the trophy. And there it is. In the background, there were a few rumours and murmurs that the trophy may not be here.
You're the first team in history to lose Game 1 and then win the series. You've done it in front of your home crowd. What a feeling.
Yeah, we will find every hard way to do anything. You wouldn't know it, but I'm only 23 years old to look at me, right?
Tracy and I, we're building a future. We're selling an idea of summers that never end. The company is called Lightwave, and we're making ball shorts.
It is my company, Trotter. Snapper's building an empire. Wait, this isn't what I came for.
I'm coming home, I'm coming home, I'm coming home to you tonight.
When did all this stop being fun?
Barons starts April 24 on ABC or log into ABC iView.
Building a home causes a range of emotions.
What? Mad! Wow.
Some visions are meticulously planned.
Every inch so well crafted.
This is exactly what I hoped it would be.
That is magic. I mean, proper magic.
Others just go with the flow.
Drunken eBay purchase. It's going to be really urban meets rural.
How are you going to do it?
Not sure yet.
All new grand designs. Next Sunday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
What's empathy training, and have you ever had it?
No, I haven't, Lee.
Can you please stand back a bit? Thank you.
Wasn't it a serious conflict of interest getting involved in any way in that grant process?
It's not just about whether it's within the rules, it's about the way it looks.
Lifting wages will have an impact.
Yeah, but how do you lift wages?
There are 9 ministers for housing in this country. What are they all doing?
1,000 jobs. Address the question.
Now is the time to speak.
7:30, Monday to Thursday, ABC TV and ABC iView.
Inside the secret world of Israel's ultra-Orthodox. While men worship, wives are expected to serve.
We'll meet some of the men who feel they should never have to work.
אני מכוון להיות בן אדם שיודע ותשאל אותי בכל הלכה שלא יהיה בארון ואני אוכל לענות לך, זה החלום שלי.
But the pressure is mounting for them to adopt modern ways.
A culture war between Jews